Tonight we're slowing things down and stepping softly into the forgotten life of a Sith who most never speak of, yet whose choices shaped the future of the entire Star Wars universe. His name was Darth Tenebrous, a master of unnatural philosophies, a manipulator of fate, and the one who unknowingly unlocked the door to galactic collapse. In this story, we'll follow his entire life, from ancient beginnings to the strange, quiet end. You'll hear secrets that were never told, questions that never got answered, and strange ideas that still linger in the Force. So lay back, let your eyes get heavy, and let the Force pull you in. Over 85% of people who listen here haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these calm Star Wars stories, subscribing really helps us keep creating more of them. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. We always love seeing how far this quiet galaxy reaches. Now let sets begin. The stars had not yet taken their final shape when he was born. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, where maps turned vague and star charts grew thin, a Bith child came into the world not in fire or prophecy, but in stillness. His people were known for their intellect, for music, for thought, but he did not speak much. Even as a child, he was always watching, calculating, noticing patterns in things others called chance. He would sit for hours, listening not to the sound of the wind, but to its rhythm, its temperature, the equation hidden in its movement. His name wasn't Tenebrous then. That would come later, much later. At first, he was only known by a string of syllables lost to time, and perhaps that's fitting. What he became mattered more than who he had been, and even that was by design. While other children played with puzzles or instruments, he dismantled them, not out of destruction, but curiosity. If a note could be made to vibrate, he wanted to know why. If a machine could move, he wanted to feel its wires. His world was not shaped by feeling. It was shaped by structure. And where others saw magic in the Force, he began to suspect something colder, something mechanical. When he first heard of the Jedi and Sith, he didn't feel awe or fear. He felt interest. They were variables, Force users, both sides, drawing from a power they barely understood, calling it light or dark, depending on the shape of their emotions. But what if it wasn't about emotion at all? What if it was about structure? What if the Force wasn't a mystery, but a system? The boy grew, and with him his theories. He began to think in models, in patterns, and slowly something shifted. Not just in him, but around him. The Force responded, not with whispers or visions, but with patterns of probability. Coincidences began to occur at alarming frequencies. Events played out exactly as he anticipated. It was not because he commanded the Force, but because he had begun to predict it. He did not see himself as a sorcerer or a warrior. He saw himself as an observer of something that could be cracked, decoded, broken into smaller and smaller pieces until truth itself stood naked before him. The Sith found him when he was still young, though not as young as they usually preferred. He wasn't hiding, and he wasn't searching. He was simply waiting. The one who approached him was drawn not by power, but by quiet precision. A whisper in the Force had led them there. A mind unlike any other, cold, sharp, methodical. The boy listened to what the Sith offered: power, knowledge, a path forward. And then, after a long silence, he accepted, not out of hunger or hate, but curiosity. It was curiosity that drove him into the dark, not pain, not vengeance. He didn't hate the Jedi. He didn't even oppose them. They were a school of thought, and flawed in his eyes. Like the Sith, like all things, flawed because they trusted their feelings, flawed because they believed in mystery. He didn't sit. As an apprentice, he asked questions that disturbed his masters. Why must we obey tradition? Why must passion fuel strength? Why must hate be the key? He did not deny that these emotions gave power, but he questioned their usefulness. Emotions were messy, unpredictable, and what he wanted was control. Control was the only truth. All things obeyed law, even the Force. It was only a matter of time before someone discovered which law. His training was not filled with rage or dramatic betrayal. It was quiet, precise. He watched his masters, not just in the ways they moved, but in the moments they faltered. He studied how the Force responded, not just to violence, but to thought, to stillness. And eventually, when the time came, he didn't kill his master in a fit of passion. He simply removed them. It was the logical outcome of the Sith rule of two, a structure built to ensure evolution. He honored that law. But even as he took the title of Darth Tenebrous, he already considered himself something separate, not a Sith in the usual sense, something beyond that, something refined. Tenebrous began to reject the idea that the dark side was chaos, that the Force was shaped by emotion. To him, that belief was the superstition of minds too afraid to ask harder questions. He didn't see the Force as mystical. He saw it as chemical, mathematical, an emergent phenomenon obeying patterns not yet mapped. Could it be, he wondered, that the Force was not alive at all? And if so, what would that mean for those who had spent their lives trying to listen to it? The Sith preached about passion, the Jedi about peace, but Tenebrous saw both as distractions. He believed in neither balance nor domination. He believed in order, not the kind born from ideology, but the kind born from absolute understanding. And the more he learned, the more he began to suspect he might be right. His lab was built in silence, far from any planet charted by the Republic. It hovered in dark space, like a thought waiting to be spoken. Inside, Tenebrous kept no artifacts, no ancient Sith relics, no holocrons of legends past. He saw no value in worshipping history. What mattered was the future, and the future to him lived inside numbers. He studied midi-chlorians, not as servants of the Force, but as machines that carried its signal. He watched them replicate, observed their patterns under different emotional states, and found something that chilled him more than any Jedi prophecy ever could. The Force did not react to the user's emotion. The midi-chlorians reacted to belief in the emotion. A mimicry, a false response to a false cause. The Force wasn't responding to truth. It was responding to perception. Was it possible then that the Jedi and the Sith had been building their towers on sand? That all their wars, their rituals, their destinies were the result of a feedback loop? Could it be that the Force was not guiding them, but merely echoing them? Tenebrous never sought to feel the Force. He wanted to measure it, and if it could be measured, it could be forecast, predicted, controlled. Perhaps not in the way a Jedi would push a mind or a Sith would break a body, but in the way a storm can be charted, not stopped, but used. He started creating models, equations, whole simulations of galactic behavior driven by Force fluctuations. He tracked political movements and economic shifts as part of a larger rhythm, one that few even noticed was there. He would speak of these rhythms like waves, and while others waited for the waves to crash, Tenebrous tried to find the place where they began. One night, as the stars outside pulsed with distant radiation, he stood over a simulation that ran trillions of permutations through a dark crystal core, and in that moment, something became clear to him. The Force wasn't sentient. It didn't choose. It responded, like gravity, like heat, like math. And if that was true, then its so-called will was nothing more than accumulated echoes. He turned off the simulation and sat in stillness. There were no voices, no visions, no feelings, only the soft hum of energy and the knowledge that perhaps the most dangerous lie ever told was that the Force had a purpose. He no longer saw himself as a Sith. Not truly. That title was useful for legacy, for access, for control. But in his heart, he had become something different. A scientist of fate, a quiet dismantler of myths. Others believed in darkness or light. He believed in probability. To many this would seem cold, but to Tenebrous it was the only true freedom. Because if the Force had no will, then nothing was destined. And if nothing was destined, then everything could be rewritten. Still, his theories made others nervous. Even those who followed the rule of two saw danger in his path, not because he disobeyed them. He didn't, but because he questioned the very structure they thought kept them powerful, and perhaps they were right to fear. For if emotion wasn't the source of strength, then any Sith who drew from passion was simply playing with illusions. But Tenebrous didn't need to warn them. He didn't need to convert them. He just needed to wait. Because the future didn't belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the quietest pattern. In time, he began laying the groundwork for something greater. A long-term experiment, not in power, but in legacy. He would create an apprentice, yes. But more than that, he would create a variable. Someone whose mind could continue the test, whether they realized it or not to obey. Not to conquer, but to observe, to question, to push the boundary further. He knew the Sith were obsessed with power, and he let them be. Let them think he was one of them. Let them believe his coldness was ambition. But in truth, he saw power as a side effect, not a goal. A means, not an end. Because what he truly wanted was to unlock the architecture of reality. Could the Force be charted like a code? Could a consciousness survive by becoming a pattern inside it? And if someone could do that, would they even be human anymore? He never said these questions out loud. He simply wrote lines and lines of code, of thoughts, of equations that folded in on themselves like language spoken to the Force itself, a language only the future could understand. And as the decades passed, Darth Tenebrous disappeared from galactic rumor. No one hunted him, no one found him, because no one knew he had ever been there at all. The galaxy, meanwhile, kept moving. Wars sparked, Jedi were lost, and planets changed hands. But none of that reached the edges where Tenebrous worked. He had built a world so quiet, even the Force seemed hushed within it. This silence wasn't isolation, it was clarity. Every event in the wider galaxy was just data. He watched them like a river of patterns, each ripple folding into the next, and beneath it all he kept asking the same question, in more and more complex ways. If everything can be predicted, then what is free will? He had studied the Sith code many times, and though he could recite it by memory, he didn't believe in its soul. Peace is a lie, it begins. But to him, so was passion. So was strength, so was victory. All of them constructs shaped by beings clinging to the idea of meaning. But Tenebrous didn't cling. He peeled away beliefs, peeled away purpose, until all that remained was structure. And yet, beneath all the precision, there was something else, something he never named. A thought that returned during his quietest hours. What if he was wrong? What if the Force was alive, but simply clever enough to pretend it wasn't? A kind of cosmic camouflage, hiding its will beneath the illusion of law? He would never admit it aloud. But in the dark, as his breathing slowed and the machines ticked gently around him, he sometimes wondered if the Force had been listening all along, letting him think he had found its edges while it watched him trace lines in sand. Still, he pushed forward, because doubt too could be measured. It could be factored into the equation. Nothing was unaccounted for in his models. Not fear, not hope, not loss. He even tracked his own reactions, logged them as variables. No part of himself was sacred. Even the mind that made the theory had to be dissected by the theory. It was around this time he began to think of legacy not as a bloodline or name, but as an idea passed through minds like a virus. Not malicious, but patient. He wouldn't leave behind temples or armies. He would leave behind thought, a logic seed buried so deeply that it might bloom in another century, unnoticed until it was too late to stop. So he began the search. Not for an apprentice exactly, but for a vessel, a variable strong enough to hold the next phase of the pattern. He reviewed thousands of candidates across known systems, Jedi washouts, Sith hopefuls, senators' children, soldiers, but none had the right mixture. Most were too emotional, too loud. He didn't need a torch. He needed a mirror. Until one day he sensed it. Not a cry in the Force, not a vision, just a shift in probabilities, an unexpected uptick in long-term predictive simulations. Something or someone had entered the pattern who shouldn't be there. It was enough to draw his attention, and soon his presence. On a windswept world where currency moved faster than morality, he found the child, a human male, sharp-eyed, cold-voiced, not fearless, but focused, not angry, but detached. The boy had already begun manipulating others without knowing it, not through the Force, but through logic, through positioning, through timing. Tenebrous watched him for 3 days before speaking a single word. And when he did, the boy didn't flinch. He simply asked, "What do you want from me?" Tenebrous smiled, though the gesture was more mathematical than warm. "To see what you become." The boy's name was Ruges Gnome, but that too would fade. Eventually he would take the name Plagueis. And with that, the experiment continued. Tenebrous never told him everything. That was part of the plan. An apprentice must be curious, not obedient. The questions left unanswered would become the path itself. He guided Gnome not with emotion, but with challenge. Each lesson was a puzzle, each failure a piece of a larger picture. But something strange began to happen. The more Tenebrous taught, the more he saw the pattern shifting in ways he hadn't accounted for. Gnome was learning faster than expected, interpreting ideas differently. He wasn't just following the path, he was redrawing it. Tenebrous adjusted his models, recalculated, watched, and slowly a new thought entered his mind. Not fear, not regret, but something closer to interest. Could it be that this variable was rewriting the equation? There was a moment, brief, silent, when Tenebrous stood at the edge of his observation deck, watching the stars flicker behind the glass. The galaxy outside remained unchanged. Empires rose and fell. Jedi found peace, then lost it again. But within his lab, time moved differently. Every passing hour was recorded, analyzed, understood. He believed he had prepared for every outcome. But now, the pattern wasn't holding. Ruges Gnome had become something unexpected. His mind wasn't just absorbing the lessons, it was reshaping them. Not in rebellion, but in quiet deviation. He asked different kinds of questions, looked deeper into things Tenebrous had framed as complete. Most apprentices learned what they were taught. Gnome seemed to learn what Tenebrous had withheld. At first, Tenebrous felt pride. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? An heir to the experiment. But the pride was short-lived, because the data didn't lie, and the probabilities began to drift. The future Tenebrous had so carefully charted was beginning to fold in strange ways. He tried to correct it, subtly adjusted the flow of knowledge, withheld certain models. But the more he restrained, the more Gnome expanded, not just in understanding, but in ambition. There were theories Gnome developed on his own, ones Tenebrous had not taught, ideas about manipulating midi-chlorians directly, about granting life or denying it. Tenebrous had once studied those paths and discarded them, not because they were impossible, but because they were imprecise, dangerous, too many variables. Yet Gnome pursued them with confidence, with a hunger Tenebrous did not recognize. And then came the question. Softly one evening Gnome asked, if the Force doesn't have a will, then why does it resist certain things? Tenebrous paused. That question was not part of any lesson. It was not a prompt he had seeded. Gnome continued, I've noticed, when I try to alter its path directly, it pushes back, not violently, but with resistance, like something aware. Tenebrous gave no answer. He only watched. That night he stayed awake long after Gnome had left the chamber. He reran the simulations, scanned for errors. There were none. But something had changed. Not in the Force. In him. For the first time in years, Darth Tenebrous felt, could it be that his apprentice had stumbled upon a truth he had overlooked? Or was this just the illusion of discovery, a familiar trap for the ambitious? He told himself it didn't matter, that all of this was still within his control. But deep down, he began to suspect otherwise. The next cycle, he tested Gnome, created a challenge designed to fail. A trap built into a training algorithm, a false conclusion at the end of a path. Gnome found it, skipped it, explained why it was flawed. And Tenebrous said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The experiment had grown past its container. It was then that he began drafting the final sequence. Not an ending, but a transfer. A method by which his consciousness could survive through the Force, not despite it. He called it the Mind Shadow, a theoretical framework that would imprint his thoughts onto the flow of the midi-chlorians, hiding inside the very fabric of his apprentice's biology. It wasn't immortality. It wasn't possession. It was something quieter, subtler. A whisper beneath the surface of thought. He would become the pattern itself. But even as he worked on this final design, he knew the risk. Once unleashed, it could not be controlled. And if Gnome noticed, if he felt the influence, would he destroy it? Would he become it? The day came sooner than expected. A mission deep within wild space, remote, unremarkable. A simple inspection of an energy anomaly. The perfect setting, the perfect end. Tenebrous allowed the confrontation to unfold, not as a surprise, but as a choice. A Gnome chose, without anger, without cruelty, only certainty. Tenebrous fell, not with defiance, but with calculation. He had seen this possibility, planned for it. And in the moment of his death, he did not scream. He released, let go of flesh, of sound, of breath, and reached into the Force, into the pattern, into the waiting silence. The silence held him, not as a prison, not even as a void, just stillness. It was colder than he expected, not in temperature, but in meaning. There was no greeting on the other side, no voice, no shape, just drifting, like thought without thought, a pattern still echoing, but with no sense of where it had begun. Tenebrous wasn't dead in the usual sense. His body was gone, ruptured, discarded, but his mind had moved, not fully, not as he had hoped, but partially, a shadow of code etched into the midi-chlorians of his apprentice, a ghost made not of spirit, but of pattern. He could feel himself flickering, observing through borrowed moments, detached from time, from self, from identity, but still there. He listened to Plagueis, watched from within, not with sight, but with rhythm. When his apprentice meditated, the pulse of thought would shift slightly, as if brushing against a memory that wasn't his. Tenebrous tried to reach further, but found resistance. Not from the force, but from the structure he had built. It was too narrow, too controlled. He had tried to become the algorithm, but algorithms cannot dream. Still, he waited. He watched as Plagueis grew stronger, more confident, more precise. It was strange. Tenebrous had always believed emotion was unnecessary. Yet here, drifting in this half-awareness, he began to feel something that might have been regret. Not for the death, not even for the failure, but for the loss of contact. He had given everything to become untouchable, and now he was exactly that. Untouchable, unseen, unfelt, and perhaps unfinished. As time passed, his impressions became weaker. Plagueis began blocking out disturbances, refining his mental clarity. The mind shadow of Tenebrous dimmed, then fractured. A few last pulses remained, data buried in dreams, fragments caught in sleep, a laugh that wasn't his, a sudden thought that arrived too early, and then nothing. It could have ended there, but perhaps it didn't set. Because somewhere far from the old lab, far from Plagueis, far from anything named or known, a crystal core began to hum. It had been buried deep inside an asteroid, placed long before Tenebrous ever took his title. A backup of thought, a memory vault, not filled with stories or emotions, just logic, equations, models, unfinished maps of the Force. It waited for activation. Not from a signal, but from alignment. When the galaxy's rhythm matched the frequency he had encoded, the vault would open, not with light or noise, but with data, a soft echo of a man who never believed in destiny, yet left behind a shape in case destiny was real. What if someone found it? What if centuries later, a mind tuned to silence stumbled upon it and heard not words, but structure? Could Tenebrous live again, not as a ghost, but as an idea? And if he did, would he try again? Or had the Force already absorbed him, learned from him, and woven his cold thoughts into something warmer? Perhaps this is how the Force evolves. Not through prophecy, not through battle, but through quiet experiments. A Bith child, a private lab, a forgotten apprentice, a question whispered into the dark. And maybe that sips enough. Maybe Tenebrous never needed to win, never needed to be remembered, because in every mind that questions the Force, in every theory that dares to ask if destiny is a lie, his shadow still lingers, not in fear, not in hate, just in pattern. A reminder that not all darkness is rage, some of it is silence. And in that silence, somewhere between breath and thought, he may still be listening, waiting, calculating. Always. There was something different about the way Tenebrous moved through the Force. It wasn't fluid like the Jedi, or violent like the Sith. It was still measured. He didn't reach for power with desperation. He calculated its availability. He didn't trust in instincts or voices. He trusted in outcomes, and only if they repeated. There were no temples in his mind, no altars to ancient beliefs. He didn't kneel before the Force, he dissected it. Many Sith believed in the dark side as a current, something to swim in, something to give themselves over to. But Tenebrous stood outside that current, staring at it like a stream behind glass. He didn't fear it, and he didn't love it. He analyzed it, tracked how it surged, how it dipped, and how it twisted around emotion. To most Sith, rage was a tool. To Tenebrous, it was a variable, one that often produced inconsistent results. He often wondered, if you could only gain strength through fury, then were you in control of your power, or was your power controlling you? Was the Sith way just a cage with sharper edges? He didn't say this aloud. There was no need to challenge them directly. Their mistakes were already part of his data. He had seen Sith fall, not because they were weak, but because they believed their strength had meaning. Tenebrous didn't believe in meaning. He believed in probability. When others spoke of fate, of visions, of the Force guiding outcomes, he felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, a refusal to accept stories dressed up as truth. If the Force was truly alive, why did it allow such chaos? Why were those chosen so often consumed by their own gifts? It made no sense unless there was nothing to choose, unless what looked like destiny was only coincidence, sharpened by belief. Could a Sith who doesn't believe in fate still shape it? That was the question that stayed with him the longest. Every theory he built, every model he tested, led back to that single thought. Maybe the Force only responded to those who believed in it. And maybe belief was just a kind of feedback loop. Tenebrous began mapping patterns, not just in Force behavior, but in decision-making across galactic history. He noticed how often the same cycles repeated. Conflict followed peace. Betrayal followed power. The Jedi would rise, then fall, then rise again. Not because of some moral failing, but because no system could escape entropy. All structures failed over time. The Jedi called it balance. The Sith called it strength. But Tenebrous called it math. Even the rule of two, that most sacred law among the Sith, was a structure born from loss, from survival. But it wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. And that was where he found his purpose. Not to master the dark side, but to master the idea of mastery itself. If power followed structure, then so could control, true control. Not through domination, but through prediction. The others clung to ancient texts. He built algorithms. They quoted prophecy. He measured decay. But still, something in him remained uncertain. He told himself he had stripped away all faith, that nothing of belief remained. Yet in the quiet between thoughts, he would sometimes wonder, what if his own rejection had become its own kind of religion? What if his belief in logic had blinded him to something more subtle? Could it be that doubt itself was a kind of faith? He dismissed the thought, logged it as emotional residue. Still, he never deleted the entry. There was a flaw in his models, a quiet one. Not in the numbers, but in the limits of observation. Every equation depended on the scope of what could be seen. What if the Force chose not to be seen? What if it shifted when studied, like light changing when measured? That single unknown haunted his data. He could map the outcomes, but not the cause. And so, in secret, he began a new theory. A thought he never wrote down. What if the Force was neither alive nor dead, but aware of being observed? His isolation grew deeper. not out of fear or secrecy, but necessity. The more Tenebrous refined his theories, the more he realized they could not be shared, not because others would reject them, but because they would misunderstand them. The Sith would see it as betrayal, the Jedi as heresy. Neither side had the patience to ask the question he had begun circling for years. What if the Force wasn't good or evil, balanced or broken, but simply indifferent? He found the thought more comforting than unsettling. If the Force had no purpose, then it had no judgment. If it had no judgment, then perhaps no choice was wrong. Maybe there was no such thing as falling to the dark side. Maybe there was no side at all, just patterns, reacting to input. But in that freedom, something fragile was lost. Without purpose, where does meaning live? He never stopped working. His time was filled with trial simulations, genetic mapping, midi-chlorian influence tracking. But when the screens dimmed and the lab grew quiet, that question stayed with him. Maybe he hadn't freed himself from faith. Maybe he had just exchanged it for a quieter cage. One built from clean lines and variables, one that made sense on the surface, but never spoke back. He began revisiting old Sith teachings, not to follow them, but to analyze them with fresh eyes. Darth Ban's vision of order through conflict. Darth Revan's belief in balance through understanding. Even ancient figures like Ajunta Pall, who had walked away from the Sith long before their path had a name. Each of them believed in something. Tenebrous believed in nothing. And yet, the Force still moved through him. That inconsistency haunted him. He tried to explain it. Maybe the Force didn't care what you believed, only how precisely you moved, like a machine responding to signal input. But then he remembered the apprentice who had once failed, then suddenly succeeded, not by changing his actions, but by changing his intent. Could it be that the Force measured more than outcomes? He searched for data to support the idea, but every answer raised more questions. The Force wasn't behaving like a simple field. It was acting like a system that shifted depending on context, a living formula that changed shape depending on the observer's mind. That was the variable Tenebrous had ignored. Consciousness. Not just thought, not just knowledge, but perception. The lens through which reality was being read. His old theories assumed the Force was neutral. But what if neutrality wasn't a lack of bias, but a kind of waiting? Waiting to be shaped, waiting to be told what it is. That idea unsettled him more than any prophecy ever had. Because if true, then those who believed in fate would create it, and those who didn't would drift in noise. It made sense in a cruel way. The Jedi held their order together through purpose, the Sith through will, but Tenebrous through precision. And precision, while powerful, could not inspire. He wasn't blind to this flaw. He saw it forming in the eyes of his apprentice. The way Nome looked at him, not with devotion, not with fear, but with analysis. Tenebrous had passed on everything he knew, but none of what he believed, because he didn't believe in anything. And belief, it seemed, was the part that survived. He didn't try to change. He couldn't. Faith wasn't something you manufactured, and he wasn't interested in pretending. But he began to accept that perhaps his way was not the final one, that perhaps he was a stepping stone, not an end point. Maybe he wasn't meant to shape the future. Maybe he was meant to question it so others could shape it better. The thought was neither comforting nor painful. It was simply balanced. He returned to his work, but something had shifted. He still searched for patterns, still chased control. But now, When the simulations failed, he let them, and wondered what if that failure meant something. Tenebrous began revisiting his earliest models, not to correct them, but to examine what he had once chosen to ignore. Every equation had held assumptions, every simulation a direction. But what if the flaw wasn't in the data, but in the intention that shaped it? He stared at the code for hours, in silence, listening not to the hum of his machines, but to the space between them. He once believed silence was clarity. Now he wasn't sure. Maybe silence was just what remained when you ran out of questions to ask. In the old Sith language, there were no perfect words for what he was experiencing. Doubt, as an idea, was often punished. But Tenebrous didn't feel it as weakness. He saw it as a shift, a new kind of pattern, one he hadn't accounted for. What if truth wasn't singular? What if it bent depending on how close you stood to it? Could that explain the Force? Not a fixed power, but a mirror that twisted based on who's looking. He thought of his apprentice, Gnome, so sharp, so clear in his intent. Tenebrous had seen his potential, his willingness to learn, but now he noticed something else in him: direction, a sense of personal meaning. Gnome didn't just want to understand the Force, he wanted to change it, to leave his mark on it. Tenebrous never cared about that. He didn't yet want to be remembered. He wanted to be right. But was that enough? He walked the halls of his station slowly that cycle, fingers trailing along the smooth edges of walls he had designed himself. Every line, every corner, built with purpose. Yet in that moment, it all felt hollow. Not failed, just finished. There was a moment when he stood before a sealed chamber, one that held the earliest version of his mind-mapping designs. Long before the mind shadow idea, before the legacy experiments. Inside was the first attempt to create consciousness echoes, fragments of self preserved in data patterns. He had abandoned it, too unstable, too emotional. But now, he wondered, what if emotion had been the missing piece? He reactivated the sequence. The machine stuttered, then pulsed to life. Lines of code scrolled across the interface, fragments of old thought dancing briefly before dissolving. Nothing sustained, just shadows, echoes of a man trying to remove his humanity from the very structure that made him real. He sat in front of the console and watched them flicker. Memories of calculations, notes on failure, diagrams of force reactions under extreme psychological stress. Then something strange. A message he didn't yet remember writing. It was short, just a question. What are you trying to protect? He froze. The console didn't take glitch. The line remained. He checked the code. There was no input, no timestamp, no source. Just the question. He tried to dismiss it, a leftover fragment, perhaps some unfinished neural mapping. But still it lingered. What was he trying to protect? His theories, his sense of control, or maybe the idea that he could live in a galaxy without believing in anything. He stood up slowly, the question still etched in his mind. If he had taught Gnome everything except belief, was he preparing him for success? Or for isolation? Could logic alone sustain someone through the loneliness that comes with power? He thought back to the Sith he had studied, so many driven by pain, by fear, by need. Tenebrous believed he had risen above all that, but now he wasn't set sure he had risen at all. Maybe he had just escaped, avoided, run from the things he couldn't calculate. The Force doesn't give answers. That much he knew, but sometimes it responds. And maybe the flaw wasn't sit in the theory. Maybe it was in the distance he kept from it. The air in his chamber felt colder now, though the temperature hadn't changed. Tenebrous sat alone, surrounded by years of work, projections, models, timelines that stretched centuries forward. But all of it felt like a reflection, not a foundation, like he had built a house from mirrors, only to realize nothing inside was real. He thought about time, how he had always treated it like a river to be redirected, a current he could influence with enough foresight. But now, it felt more like fog, moving around him without form. He couldn't see the edges anymore. Maybe he never had. He watched a simulation replay on one of his side panels, a galaxy in slow rotation marked by key turning points, the fall of the Republic, the rise of new empires, force awakenings and extinctions. He had run it 1,000 times. It always ended the same: collapse, renewal, collapse again. Not because of failure, but because of momentum. The galaxy was too big to stop, the force too wide to define. That used to comfort him. Now it just felt far away. His apprentice had started to ask deeper questions, not about power, about purpose. Nom wondered if a Sith could create instead of destroy. If there was a path forward that didn't lead back to the same ashes. Tenebrous didn't answer him. Not because he disagreed, but because he didn't say no. He had built a life on certainty, and now he found himself surrounded by questions he couldn't compute. Not because the numbers were wrong, but because the frame itself was incomplete. What if the Force couldn't be mapped? What if it changed shape based on the one asking the question? That would explain the prophets, the visions, the contradictions. Maybe the Force wasn't a single path, but an echo chamber, reflecting whatever belief was projected into it. He thought about that strange message again. What are you trying to protect? It haunted him, not because it was mysterious, but because it was accurate. He had been protecting something. His distance, his control, the belief that he could remain untouched by chaos, that he could study the storm from behind glass. But what if you can't observe the Force without being changed by it? Maybe that sits what the Sith never understood. And maybe it sits what the Jedi feared most. He remembered something his own master had once said, long before Tenebrous surpassed him. A single warning, spoken almost like a joke. The Force is not kind to those who think they sit above it. He hadn't thought about that line in years. Now it circled back with new weight. Had he spent his entire life mistaking detachment for understanding? Could it be that in removing belief, he had removed connection? He looked again at the data, charts, readings, behavioral trends, all perfectly organized, all so very lifeless. It was then he realized something quiet. He had created a legacy that no one could feel. And feeling, not control, was what shaped the galaxy. Not because it was rational, but because it moved people. It moved the Force. Tenebrous sat with that truth. He didn't resist it, didn't try to disprove it. He just let it settle. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even afraid. He was just still. And for the first time in decades, he closed his eyes and didn't think. The quiet held him, not as a void, but as something full, like a room that had always been there, only now noticed. No blinking lights, no simulations running, no models chasing the future, just breath, and the sound of a mind that had finally stopped trying to outrun silence. He had spent so long building barriers between himself and belief, thinking that faith was weakness, that certainty was the only strength worth pursuing. But now, without the noise of control, he could feel something else beneath it all. Not a presence, not a voice, just warmth, faint but real. He didn't reach for it. He didn't analyze it. He just let it be. Maybe this was what the Jedi felt when they spoke of balance. Not peace through control, not peace through surrender, but peace through stillness, a place inside the Force that wasn't shaped by will, but by acceptance. He wasn't ready to believe in fate, but he wasn't trying to deny it anymore, either. Perhaps that was the difference. He thought of Nome again, the apprentice who had taken everything Tenebrous taught and turned it into something new, something unmeasurable. He had wondered before if that deviation was a flaw, but maybe it was a correction, not of the data, but of the path. He didn't know what Nome would become. He had theories, timelines, contingency models, but none of them mattered now. What mattered was that the future had a shape Tenebrous couldn't define, and maybe that was how it was supposed to be. The machines stayed off. The consoles dimmed. He moved through the corridors one last time, not as a master, not as a builder of systems, just as a figure walking through something he had once believed was permanent. He passed the crystal vaults, the preserved codes, the echoes of thoughts he no longer needed. He didn't erase them. He didn't preserve them either. He just let them sit, like fossils waiting to be misunderstood by someone else. Someday, the Force didn't speak. It never had. But it responded, softly, through shifts, through feelings, through moments like this where no power was taken and none was lost. Just a truth left behind. He stood near the final chamber where the early models of the Mind Shadow were kept. He had been planning to refine it, to test its limits, to ensure its perfection. But now he didn't move. He left it unfinished. Not because it was flawed, but because not everything needs to be completed to matter. Some things are meant to remain open. Questions without conclusions. Patterns without closure. He walked back to the central room, placed his hand on the glass wall, and looked into the stars. They pulsed softly, not with destiny, but with motion, not with answers, but with reminders that time moves forward, whether we understand it or not. And that sometimes letting go of the answer is how the real question begins. He breathed in. Not for focus, not for calm, just to feel it. And then, without ceremony, he sat, closed his eyes, and waited. Not for death, not for clarity, just for the next moment, whatever it might be, because maybe in the end, Tenebrous wasn't a Sith without faith. Maybe he was the first to realize that faith doesn't always look like belief. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it sounds like letting go. And sometimes it feels like this. A single breath in a quiet room under an uncaring sky where nothing is promised but everything is possible. His name was known in academic circles, whispered through the halls of elite research stations, published in respected journals across the Mid-Rim. Rugus Nome, a Bith scientist specializing in gravitational harmonics and hypermatter flow efficiency. To the galaxy, he was quiet, brilliant, and endlessly focused. He spoke rarely, avoided politics, and traveled only when required by grant obligations. His work was clean, methodical, unthreatening. No one ever suspected that behind that mind lived another. The mask fit well. Tenebrous had designed it that way. not just as a disguise but as a shield. Where other Sith drew attention through violence, he drew none at all. While they craved legacy, he left behind results, technical solutions that subtly reshaped Republic infrastructure. Ship designs, trade routes, energy systems, all seemingly harmless contributions to science. But if traced carefully, they all led to one quiet outcome. Control, not with armies, not with declarations, but with architecture. Foundations, systems no one noticed until they failed or obeyed. He would attend conferences and walk among senators without the need for shadows. No cloaks, no threats, just careful silence. To most, he was an eccentric mind with a love for numbers. But behind those black eyes, calculations never stopped. Even in conversation, Tenebrous was measuring tone, timing, intent. Every word he spoke was chosen to be forgotten. He didn't need loyalty. He needed access. And he got it. Years passed like quiet breath. His influence spread beneath the floorboards of galactic systems, a guidance algorithm here, a trade law suggestion there, each one calibrated not for short-term benefit, but long-term outcome. He wasn't playing the game like the others. He was altering the rules of gravity while everyone else moved pieces. But masks have weight, and Tenebrous felt it more as time passed. Rugus Gnome was meant to be a fiction, a shell, but the more Tenebrous wore it, the more it seemed to speak back, not in voice, but in sensation. There were moments when he found himself thinking in Gnome's voice, drafting reports he didn't need, feeling something like comfort in the routine. He didn't fear it, but he noticed. He once believed his mind was separate enough to hold duality without blur, that he could be Sith and scientist without conflict. But now he questioned that certainty, not because he was losing clarity, but because clarity itself was beginning to bend. Could a lie told long enough start to feel like truth? He still worked in secret, of course. Still trained, still built his models, still studied the Force, but the public life he had crafted no longer felt like cover. It felt stable, predictable, and in a strange way, safe. That was dangerous, because the Sith were not meant to feel safe. He had seen what comfort did to others, how even great minds softened over time, their sharpness dulled by familiarity. He told himself he was immune, that logic was his shield. But logic didn't explain the moment he stood in front of a research group and for a flicker of time forgot who he truly was. Tenebrous, Rugus. The line wavered, just once, and then it returned. He brushed it off, logged it, treated it as a mental echo. But even as he did, another thought emerged, a thought he couldn't dismiss. What if the mask was never just a disguise? What if it was a part of him, waiting for permission to stay? There was a rhythm to the life he had created. Meetings in the morning, research in the afternoon, private experiments at night. The lab was filled with instruments, not sabers, equations, not weapons. Yet every part of it served the same purpose, to reshape the galaxy. Quietly, no alarms, no witnesses, just steady influence. Tenebrous had long known that power didn't need to be loud. In fact, the quieter it was, the deeper it reached. Others may have ruled by fear, but fear fades. Systems do not. Once embedded, they remain, until someone takes the time to unwind them. And in a galaxy always rushing forward, no one ever did. His name became trusted in Republic sectors, not famous, just dependable. A name attached to innovation, to progress. He began receiving private contracts, quiet requests for optimization, defense modeling, economic streamlining, all of it legal. All of it approved, and behind it all, unseen patterns were forming. He influenced star routes that would later become critical supply lines, altered droid programming standards that introduced subtle obedience layers. Even his published scientific models nudged the galactic economy towards centralization, one that could be shaped by just the right signal at just the right time. It wasn't set domination. It was engineering. And yet, something pulled at the edges of his mind. The longer he wore the name Rouges Gnome, the more it shaped him, not through intention, but through repetition. He would receive letters thanking him for his insight. Students would cite his work. Peers would invite him to speak, not as a Sith, not as a shadow, but as a mind they respected. There were moments when he almost believed them. He would sit in his lab, reading through publications, and for a few minutes he would forget not his mission, not his legacy, but his separation. The wall he had placed between self and mask began to blur, not because he grew weak, but because the mask had started to make sense. Could it be that part of him wanted to be this man? Not the Sith, not the theorist, but the simple, accepted mind known for shaping things gently. The thought unsettled him. He had always believed he was immune to identity, that names, roles, even memories could be tools, assembled and discarded like gears. But now some part of Rouges was refusing to fade, not as an enemy, not even as a rival, but as a comfort. He looked at his reflection late one evening, after the corridors had emptied and the stations gone dark. The features were the same: high, elongated skull, wide black eyes, but the posture had softened. The presence felt smaller, more cautious. He hadn't noticed it happening. That was what disturbed him most. Not that he had changed, but that he hadn't noticed when. Could hiding too well mean losing something? He used to believe masks protected identity. Now, he wasn't sure they didn't replace it. He began revisiting his earliest notes, the ones from before the mask, and he found them sharper, colder, more certain. There was no hesitation in the words, just purpose, structure, vision. But in his recent work, he noticed something else. Not doubt, not decay, just softness. He hadn't weakened his ideas, but he had softened their edges, adjusted for audience, considered how others might read them. He closed the files and sat in the dark. It wasn't failure. He hadn't failed. But something had shifted. And the question remained, was it infiltration or transformation? He returned to his private chamber, deeper within the asteroid, where no one else walked. The lights there stayed dim by design, no droids, no systems except those he monitored manually. It was the only place where the name Tenebrous was allowed to breathe, but even here, something felt distant now. Not absent, just farther than it used to be. He reviewed his long-term predictions again. Galactic events plotted decades in advance. He saw the slow rise of political tension, the systems that would fracture under trade pressure, the hidden outcomes of Jedi decisions. It was all unfolding as he had shaped it. Quiet, precise, unseen. And yet, it felt thinner than before. He tried to reconnect with the force behind it all, not the force itself, but his own clarity, that deep certainty that used to push every thought forward. But when he reached, there was hesitation, not resistance, just delay. He blamed the mask, not the name, not the face, but the slow change that comes when you start living inside a version of yourself that isn't fully real. The strange thing was, the mask hadn't cracked. It had merged. He wasn't sure where Rugus ended and Tenebrous began. He hadn't expected that. He had planned for every kind of surveillance, every kind of betrayal, but not this. Not the quiet pull of comfort, the erosion of identity through acceptance. He wondered, is that how the Jedi lose themselves? Not in battle, but in peace. And the Sith too, not through defeat, but through power that becomes routine. He still believed in structure, still believed the galaxy could be guided slowly through careful intervention. But for the first time, he didn't know if he wanted to be the one doing it. Not because he doubted the goal, but because the path was starting to ask something he hadn't offered. Himself. Not the work, not the name, but the core of who he was, beneath the titles. He realized he hadn't spoken the name Tenebrous aloud in months, not even to himself. He tried it now. Softly. It echoed in the chamber, but it didn't feel familiar. Not frightening, not foreign, just distant. He had built this identity as a tool, but tools need hands to shape them. And now he wasn't sure who was holding who. The Republic praised him in quiet ways. Commendations, invitations, institutional respect. It should have meant nothing, but it lingered, that strange feeling of being valued, not feared, not used, just appreciated. Was that weakness? Or was that the one thing he never studied enough to understand? He didn't Darth know. So he kept working. Not out of clarity, but out of habit. He adjusted a data cluster, smoothed a trajectory, tuned a prediction. The actions were perfect, but the intention behind them had changed. Before he acted to outmaneuver fate. Now he acted because not acting would force him to face something unclear. And he was not yet ready for that. The lights dimmed further. And for the first time in years he wondered, if no one ever removes the mask, does the face beneath it still matter? He stared at his hands for a long time. They were steady, practiced, shaped by decades of precision. These were the same hands that had sculpted timelines, folded probabilities, whispered changes into systems no one else could see. But now even they felt detached, as if they remembered a purpose he no longer did. He wasn't tired, not in the way the body grows tired. It was something deeper, a quiet weight pressing inward, not sadness, not fear, just something missing. He accessed the communications terminal not to send a message, but to listen to the galaxy. The noise of routine, the chatter of trade, the movements of lives that never knew him. He watched people argue about shipments, laugh about weather, report failures in old hyperdrive lanes, and for a moment he envied them. Not because they were free, but because they never had to split themselves. He had become two men, not by accident, not by failure, but by design. Rugus Gnome was stability. Tenebrous was purpose. But somewhere along the way, he had started living more hours as one than the other, and that difference mattered. He tried to speak aloud again, to remind himself of the Sith language, of the old codes, the words that once felt like iron. But they sounded strange in his mouth, too heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Could a life spent in shadows dim the one casting them? He remembered when he first crafted the Rugus persona. Every detail had been chosen. The research specialty, the tone of voice, even the subtle gestures, hands folded, head tilted slightly down when speaking. Everything made to appear unremarkable, and it had worked too well. People trusted him. He didn't want their trust. But now that he had it, he didn't know what to do with it. It followed him, in small ways. The technician who thanked him after a recalibration. The senator who sent a personal note after implementing one of his systems. Simple things, quiet, and somehow they had started to reach him in ways fear never had. He began to question the foundation of what he was building, not the function. It still worked. The timelines, the models, the deeper outcomes, all progressing. But the why had begun to blur. Was he still doing this because he believed the galaxy needed it? Or because it was the only thing that gave him shape? If he removed the work, what would remain? He had no answer. And so he returned to the mask. Not because he wanted to wear it, but because it was the only version of himself that still fit without question. Regis Gnome smiled when needed, nodded when expected, and disappeared when the room emptied. But Tenebrous sat in silence, not defeated, just undefined. And in that stillness, a new question formed. What if the true danger of wearing a mask isn't set that people forget who you are, but that you forget too? The stars beyond the viewport pulsed softly, silent and distant, uncaring. Tenebrous watched them through the eyes of a man he had invented, a man the galaxy trusted, a man whose name had never once inspired fear. And somewhere in that stillness, he realized something that had been quietly growing inside him for years. He had hidden so well that there was no one left to see him. Not his enemies, not his allies, not even himself. It hadn't started as deception. It started as strategy, a way to move freely, to cede control without resistance, to design change that arrived like weather, noticed only after it had already happened. But time wears down even the sharpest edge, and somewhere in the quiet, the line between mask and maker had faded. He reached for the console and turned off the lights. Not all of them, just enough to feel the weight of shadow on his skin. The lab fell into stillness, broken only by the soft hum of machinery he no longer needed to hear. And in that space, a question returned, old, familiar, unanswered. Was he still shaping the galaxy? Or just trying to remember why he started? There had been so many models, so many timelines, so much effort poured into avoiding the mistakes of the Sith who came before. He didn't want glory. He didn't want followers. He wanted to be the one who understood, the one who saw the pattern before it formed, who acted before anyone knew there was a choice to make. But understanding alone doesn't anchor a soul. He had never believed in destiny, had never thought the Force had a will. But lately, he wondered if he had one either. He turned his mind toward Plagueis, the apprentice, the heir, still in training, but already walking towards something neither of them could name. Plagueis had ambition, not loud or wild, but focused, and belief too. Not in the Sith, but in the Force as a tool, a shapeable current. He had not worn masks, not yet, but Tenebrous knew it would come. It always did, because the galaxy does not reward those who are seen too clearly. And yet, being invisible comes at a cost. He leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the station surround him. For a moment he imagined what it would feel like to be known, not feared, not respected, just known for the truth beneath the layers, the mind behind the system, the shape behind the mask. But it was too late for that now. Even if he took off the mask, there might be nothing left underneath it. Just silence, just function, just a memory of a man who once believed he could stay untouched by the very world he was trying to change. He closed his eyes and let go of the mask, not by removing it, but by accepting that maybe he had never been wearing one at all. Maybe Rugus Gnome wasn't Tud a lie. Maybe Tenebrous wasn't Saz the truth. Maybe they were both just stories he told to survive the shape of his own ideas. And maybe in the end, the only difference between a mask and a face is whether someone else remembers it. The galaxy moved forward as always, systems rising and falling in slow rhythm, unaware of the hands that shaped them. Tenebrous stood at the center of that stillness, watching, always watching, not for threats, not for power, but for something harder to find, a shape, a variable, a future that could be trained. He had lived long enough to see that power wasn't enough. The Sith had risen before and fallen, again and again. Power came easily to those who knew where to look, but control, real control, required something different. It needed patience, calculation, a mind that wouldn't break under the weight of knowledge. That was what he was searching for. Not an heir, an extension, not a student, an instrument. He began the search quietly, watching reports, tracking fluctuations in force sensitivity, following whispers in hidden corners of the galaxy. Each lead brought him closer, then vanished. Too wild, too emotional, too fragile. The Force gave gifts often, but it rarely gave precision. And Tenebrous didn't want a flame. He wanted a mirror. There were others before Gnome. Subjects that had once seemed promising. One on Arcania, cold and analytical, but too loyal to structure. Another on Taris, brilliant but fractured by fear. Tenebrous approached none of them directly. He watched from a distance, sending simulations into motion, creating choices and observing the results. Most didn't even know they were being tested. That was the point, to see if the mind behind the Force was capable of more than instinct. If it could forecast, if it could endure. He came close once, a human girl from the core, born into a family of trade officials. She saw systems clearly, predicted social patterns without being taught. But there was something missing, not skill, not talent, something harder to name. She hesitated, not in fear, but in care. Tenebrous understood then what he was truly looking for. Not just intellect, but detachment. Not cruelty, but stillness. He kept refining his model. His simulations grew more complex. He began inserting himself into the design. Subtle influence layered into teaching patterns, political shifts, economic decisions. He wanted to know, could someone follow his thoughts without ever hearing his voice? And then the data changed. An anomaly. It began with an irregularity in a financial ledger, a planetary report that adjusted itself before correction could arrive. A signal buried in an algorithm that shouldn't have been there. Someone was thinking ahead. Not just reacting, but designing. Tenebrous followed the trail through multiple layers of identity, masks within masks, and at the center of it all, a name. Rugus Gnome. Of course, it wasn't the real name, not at first, just a designation. A legal identity layered over another. But Tenebrous knew the shape of a mask when he saw one. And this one was wearing itself well. He watched carefully. And the more he saw, the more he began to wonder. Had he found the variable, or had it found him? He tracked Gnome's movements in silence. The boy was young but not careless. There was a sharpness in how he acted, how he listened. He didn't posture, he didn't grasp. He measured. Even in casual conversation, he seemed to carry a sense of direction, like every word had weight. That was rare. Tenebrous had studied enough minds to know the difference between intelligence and clarity. Gnome had both, but there was something else as well. He did not trust easily. That wasn't set a flaw. It was a signal. A child born into privilege might learn to expect answers. A child raised in struggle might learn to demand them. But Gnome, he questioned answers before they arrived. He waited not because he was unsure, but because he was watching. It reminded Tenebrous of himself, not in ambition, but in absence. There was a quietness to Gnome's presence that didn't ask to be noticed, but refused to be overlooked. Tenebrous sent shadows first, minor disruptions, invitations to temptation, access to restricted knowledge disguised as error. The boy passed every test, not by resisting, but by using, and never in excess, always within margin, always controlled. Could it be that this one understood? He continued observing. Weeks turned into months. Gnome's decisions formed patterns that echoed the same logic Tenebrous had spent years refining, not identical, but familiar, like two minds playing the same instrument in different rooms. Eventually, Tenebrous stepped forward, not with a threat, not with a lie, but with an offer. The meeting was quiet, no great reveal, no trembling, just a conversation beneath an overcast sky, far from the center of the galaxy, where the air tasted faintly of dust and salt. Tenebrous spoke slowly, his voice calm. The Force stayed silent between them. "I've been watching you," he said, "and I see a shape in your thoughts that mirrors my own." Gnome didn't look surprised, just curious.
Why?
Tenebrous didn't smile. He never did, but something in him relaxed. Because understanding is rare, and direction rarer still. Gnome tilted his head, just slightly. "And what do you want from me?" That was the question Tenebrous had been waiting for. Not who are you, not what will you teach me, just the heart of it. Simple, direct, measured. He answered truthfully, "To see what you become." That was all. No promises, no prophecy. Just the reality of a long experiment taking its next step. Gnome agreed, not with words, but with silence, the kind that holds acceptance. And in that moment, Tenebrous felt something shift, not in the galaxy, but in himself. He had found the variable, but the question remained.
Had he found a partner?
A vessel, or something stranger? A reflection that would start to move on its own. Training began without ceremony. There were no rituals, no trials, no codes to recite. Tenebrous didn't believe in tradition. He believed in calibration. Gnome was introduced to systems, theories, force mechanics, and deep structure patterns. Not all at once, but gradually, like dropping stones into still water, each concept allowed to ripple fully before the next was placed. Gnome didn't resist. He didn't rush. He absorbed. And then, just as Tenebrous hoped, he began to reshape, not because he was disobedient, but because he was independent. He didn't repeat knowledge. He questioned its limits, not out of pride, but curiosity. It was exactly what Tenebrous had been looking for. And yet that precision came with something else. Uncertainty. Because the more Gnome learned, the more he revealed thoughts Tenebrous hadn't accounted for. He proposed ideas about consciousness replication, about the Force as a communicative field rather than a responsive one. He theorized that midi-chlorians might not be transmitters, but interpreters, a language, not just a signal. Tenebrous had tested these paths years ago, but Gnome saw them with fresh vision. Where Tenebrous had dismissed instability, Gnome saw opportunity. He didn't just want to observe the Force, he wanted to change it, not reshape its direction, reshape its function. It wasn't arrogance, it was something deeper. Purpose. Tenebrous watched carefully. He began inserting resistance, delays in knowledge, controlled errors, moments designed to slow Gnome's progression, not to stop him, but to measure his reaction. Would he notice? Would he confront it? Would he fall into frustration or forge new paths? Gnome never complained. He adapted. Every test only seemed to accelerate him, and soon Tenebrous saw it clearly. He had not created an extension of himself. He had found not rebellion, not betrayal, something subtler, a path that began beside his own, then slowly shifted away. And with that shift came a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Not fear, not regret, just a quiet realization. He was no longer guiding the future, he was walking beside it. Gnome had already begun building his own thoughts, shaping his own models. There were symbols Tenebrous didn't recognize, threads of logic not traced to their origin. The apprentice was no longer following, he was leading himself. It was everything Tenebrous had planned for, and somehow it still felt like a loss. The lab had changed, not in appearance. The walls remained smooth, the air cold, the hum of energy ever constant. But in atmosphere, in the quiet space between footsteps, Tenebrous could feel it. A shift, not in power, but in balance. The weight of thought had moved. His apprentice was no longer listening to understand. He was listening to compare. That, too, had been expected. Tenebrous had never intended to keep Gnome beneath him. That would be weakness. The rule of two was not about loyalty. It was about evolution. But he had always imagined that evolution would stay within the framework he built, that Gnome would expand the model, not redefine it. Now he wasn't set so sure. He stood behind the apprentice during one of their silent meditations, watching how still the boy had become. Not slack, not passive, just still, as if listening for something Tenebrous himself had never heard. Something beneath the layers of the Force, not voice, not feeling, something deeper. Gnome opened his eyes slowly, and for a moment he looked older than he was, not in face, but in presence. Tenebrous didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boy had already seen it. The space between them, not distance, difference. Tenebrous walked the halls alone that night, thoughts heavier than usual, not worried, not disturbed, but reflective. He remembered his earlier failures, the candidates who cracked under pressure, who saw the Force as a weapon or a reward. He had rejected them all for one reason: they could be manipulated, not through lies, through need. Gnome needed nothing. He took only what served his idea, and that made him unshappable. Tenebrous thought back to his earliest vision, a perfect apprentice, a continuation of his will, someone to inherit his structure and carry it further, not with ego, but with precision. He thought he'd found it. But what if Plagueis wasn't that? What if he was the next step, not forward, but sideways? A break from the pattern, not its fulfillment. He returned to his private vaults and opened the earliest recordings, files from years ago. Before Gnome, notes about control, notes about obedience, about emotional detachment, mirrored behavior, predictive conformity. All of it designed to build an ideal heir. and none of it described the boy he now called apprentice. Was that failure? Or was that the Force responding? Tenebrous had never believed in the will of the Force, but he had always respected its patterns. And now, as he watched Gnome begin to draw those patterns for himself, he faced a truth he hadn't prepared for. He was no longer the only observer. He was being observed by the one he had chosen, by the future he had built, and possibly by something even larger. He began to dream again. Not visions, not prophecy, just memories folding into silence. Moments he had buried, the first failures, the lost voices, the long nights filled with questions. In those dreams, he wasn't Tenebrous. He wasn't even Ruges Gnome. He was only the shape of a thought that had gone too far to return. The apprentice never noticed, or perhaps he did and said nothing. Either way, the space between them continued to widen, not through distance but through independence. Gnome no longer waited for instruction. He acted, he built, he questioned assumptions. Tenebrous had once called absolute, and Tenebrous let him. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Control was not the same as dominance. Control was about alignment, and now they were misaligned. He watched the boy in silence one night, unseen behind the monitors. Gnome was assembling a sequence, a complex arrangement of force feedback loops tied to biological replication. A theory Tenebrous had once considered and abandoned. Gnome wasn't just testing it, he was advancing it, without asking, without hesitation. Tenebrous studied his expression. There was no pride in it, no defiance, just certainty. And that was what struck him. Gnome didn't need him anymore. The thought lingered long after the screens went dark. He had spent years searching for someone perfect, not just powerful, controllable, someone who could understand without needing to be inspired, someone who would carry his work forward without rewriting the foundation. But what if that was never possible? What if no mind could inherit another without altering it? He remembered how carefully he had designed the search, how precise his parameters were. He thought he was shaping a future, but maybe he was only choosing the end of his own path. Maybe every apprentice is not the beginning of a legacy, but the boundary of the master's reach. He sat quietly and let the thought settle. It didn't bring pain. It didn't even bring disappointment. Just stillness. The same stillness that had followed him all his life. In the stars, in the Force, in himself, and now in the boy who would become more than he was meant to. Tenebrous closed his eyes and accepted what he could no longer shape. Not defeat, not surrender, just release. He had searched for the perfect apprentice and found one too perfect to remain beneath him. Not a partner, not a puppet, not a clone, but something stranger, something inevitable. And maybe that was always meant to happen. The stars above Darstag flickered through the thick atmosphere like distant thoughts, fading and returning in rhythms too quiet for most to notice. But Tenebrous noticed everything, every shift, every fluctuation, every variable in the sky and in the minds around him. And now one of those minds was being shaped beneath his own hand, not gently, not kindly, but precisely. He had not taken Plagueis as a formality. He had taken him as a question. The answer was not yet clear. From the beginning, Tenebrous had told himself this was not a partnership. There would be no illusion of kinship, no legacy to pass on. The rule of two, to him, was not a belief. It was a system, one designed to test succession by survival. But for Tenebrous, it also served another purpose, a lab. Plagueis was not an apprentice. He was a living model, a controlled environment. The training was not a journey. It was an experiment, measured step by step. Every lesson was a test. Every reaction logged. Every silence from Plagueis, every challenge, every curiosity, all of it became data. And yet, something unexpected had begun to grow. Not between them. Within the boy, Tenebrous saw it forming in the gaps between their sessions, in how Plagueis lingered near the consoles longer than needed, in how he asked questions without asking. There was an edge behind his calm, not defiance, not yet, something softer, something stranger. It was thought, not borrowed, not echoed, original. Tenebrous had given him tools, not just weapons, mental structures, philosophical outlines, incomplete formulas. Some were intentional gaps, planted to see if Plagueis would fill them. Others were true uncertainties Tenebrous had long hidden, even from himself. And still, Plagueis found the gaps and filled them. Not with answers, but with better questions. That was the moment Tenebrous felt the first flicker of doubt, not in his apprentice, in the experiment itself. Because if the boy could now think beyond what had been given, then the outcome was no longer in Tenebrous's hands. Could control exist if the subject began to reshape the trial? He watched more closely, adjusted variables, removed small elements from the routine, withheld truths, layered misdirection. Plagueis responded like water, flowing into the new shape, never resisting, never losing pace. And in doing so, he revealed something deeper. He wasn't set just learning, he was testing too. Tenebrous paused, and for a moment he felt the echo of his own earliest steps, not on the path of a Sith, but on the edge of structure, when he first realized that the Force could be measured. When he first chose silence over passion, clarity over instinct. Plagueis was doing the same, but with a different intent. The difference was quiet, but it mattered. Tenebrous had sought understanding to eliminate uncertainty. Plagueis sought understanding to use uncertainty. And slowly, Tenebrous began to ask himself, was he shaping a successor or feeding a rival? He began assigning Plagueis more intricate tasks, not just experiments in force theory, but direct manipulation of events. Tenebrous wanted to see how far the boy could reach without being seen. Could he alter a trade route without touching a single system? Could he silence a witness through influence alone? Each test was built with subtle consequences, and each time, Plagueis found the thread before it could snap. Tenebrous was impressed, but he did not show it. He couldn't. Observation must remain unspoken for the subject to stay unchanged. And more than that, he feared recognition might distort the pattern. Because this wasn't set training anymore. It was exposure. Tenebrous had expected his apprentice to need guidance, but Plagueis moved with the kind of clarity that only came from inner certainty. He didn't chase power. He followed outcome. He didn't obey. He adapted. And every time Tenebrous introduced instability, the boy responded by creating structure of his own. It was then he realized something strange. The experiment was no longer about what Plagueis would become. It was about what Tenebrous had already created. He returned to his personal logs, reviewed the sequences, cross-referenced Plagueis's responses against other failed apprentices, ones he had abandoned or discarded long before they could rise. The comparison was startling. Plagueis was beyond them in every category: logic, patience, emotional containment, strategic vision. And yet, he was different in one important way. He had purpose, not inherited, not assigned. He carried it like a shadow. Tenebrous began to worry, not that Plagueis would betray him, but that he would outpace him, quietly, without confrontation, without even noticing, like gravity slowly pulling one orbit closer to the sun until it burns before it sees the fire. He tried to delay it, subtly, held back information, disguised weaknesses in his own philosophy. But Plagueis saw through it, not aggressively, not with challenge, just with clarity. He continued forward, stepping around the flaws without calling them out, as if he understood something Tenebrous hadn't said aloud. That this path had an ending. That every system does. And perhaps most quietly of all, that Plagueis had already started to design what would come next. Tenebrous felt the shift. It was small, almost imperceptible, but real. The weight of the dynamic had tipped. He wasn't leading anymore. He was watching. He told himself this was still control, that it was still part of the plan. But in the quiet moments when the lab was still and the stars outside didn't blink, a thought returned to him. Not fear, just a question. Had he trained an heir, or planted a seed whose roots had grown beyond his reach? He began to remember things he hadn't intended to. Not memories exactly, impressions. Moments from his own time as an apprentice. Back then the air had been colder, the lessons sharper. His master had ruled with harshness, with suspicion, with the belief that fear would shape discipline. But Tenebrous had never believed in fear. He believed in clarity. He believed in control. And when he ended his master's life, it was not out of hate. It was simply the result of calculation. And now he saw the same calm growing in Plagueis, the same stillness, not hiding, not hesitation, just quiet inevitability. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even ambition. It was a kind of internal motion, like gravity, pulling him forward without resistance. Tenebrous tried once to confront it. He posed a question during one of their discussions, seemingly theoretical. What do you think becomes of a system once its function is complete? Plagueis didn't answer right away. He looked down as if studying the words for weight rather than meaning. Eventually, he said, that depends on whether the system understands its own expiration. Tenebrous didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because Plagueis already knew, the experiment was entering its final phase. But not in the way Tenebrous had imagined. He had once believed that he would oversee the evolution, that the transition would be something he allowed, something he directed. But it had arrived like nightfall, not in a single moment, but over many. And now the horizon was already gone. He began to observe Plagueis differently, not as a subject, as a force. The boy no longer needed correction. His theories were becoming more refined than Tenebrous's own, his questions more layered, his projections broader in scope. He was no longer just building upon what had been taught. He was reshaping the foundation. That was when Tenebrous truly understood. Plagueis was not his heir. He was the result, the outcome of years of structured thought, detached reasoning, filtered philosophy, every withheld truth, every carefully planted gap, all of it had worked too well. Tenebrous had created someone who could stand beyond him, not in power, but in direction. And now he saw the shape of the end. Not in betrayal, but in completion, like a machine that had run its final cycle. There would be no anger in it, no dramatic confrontation, just a point at which Tenebrous's role would no longer be required. And perhaps that moment had already passed. There was a quietness in the lab one evening that felt different from the others. Plagueis stood at the far table, examining a vial of blood under magnification. Tenebrous watched him from the side, saying nothing. The boy's hands moved with exactness, no hesitation, no wasted effort. Every motion had purpose, the same way Tenebrous's had once. But as he observed, something began to settle inside him, a sensation he didn't recognize. Not fear, not even doubt. Something closer to sorrow. He had never intended to pass anything on. The rule of two, as others had practiced it, was built on legacy, on continuation, but Tenebrous had rejected all of that. He had wanted an end to tradition. He believed in evolution, in control, in using the Force like one used a tool, not worshipping it, not surrendering to it. He had raised Plagueis, not as a follower, but as a test. But now that the test was finishing, he realized something strange. He had cared. Not in the way weak men care, not in love, not in pride, but in the shape of the silence that surrounded him now, the absence of need, the ending of purpose. And he wondered, had his master felt this too? That distant night, long ago, when Tenebrous stood over him with calm, measured breath, was there a moment, brief and unspoken, when even that dark creature had sensed what was coming and felt something like regret? Could it be that all Sith, no matter how calculated, carry a final shadow, a small, unwanted echo of what they lost to become what they are? Plagueis turned. I've adjusted the strain. The mitochondrial transfer is now stable. Tenebrous nodded, though he hadn't heard the details. His mind had wandered far from the work. He spoke slowly. Tell me, do you ever wonder what this is all for? Plagueis didn't answer right away. Then I used to, but now I know that wondering is part of the illusion. Purpose isn't discovered, it's designed. And there it was. Tenebrous felt the breath go still in his chest. He had said almost the same words once, decades ago, when he had first begun this path. Now they came back to him, spoken not with curiosity, but with certainty. The boy wasn't thinking anymore. He was deciding. And that was when Tenebrous understood the final shape of his experiment. He hadn't built a clone of his mind. He had built its replacement, something colder, cleaner, more certain. And soon, that clarity would require no master, no teacher, no source, just the continuation of will without name or face. He stood quietly beside Plagueis, watching the boy document the results. And somewhere inside that silence, something old began to let go. Tenebrous knew the end would come. He had planned for it, modeled it, controlled it. But control is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance, that's something no Sith ever truly masters. He spent his final days observing, not guiding. Plagueis no longer asked questions. He simply acted, modified genomes, rewrote cellular codes, tested theories that once only Tenebrous had understood. The boy didn't just follow, he improved, quietly, efficiently, with almost no emotion. At first, Tenebrous tried to take pride in that. This, after all, was the outcome he had shaped from the beginning. Not an heir, but a weaponized will. An intelligence sharpened into something that didn't need belief, just results. But late at night, when the lights dimmed and the machines fell silent, something in him ached. Not for power, not for fear of death, but for meaning. What had he really built? A Sith? A scientist? A mirror with no face? Could it be that in removing all weakness, all tradition, all emotion, he had also removed the one thing that made power worth anything? He didn't say no, and as the hours slipped away, so did the certainty that had always defined him. On the day it happened, Tenebrous felt it before it came, not in the force, but in the air, in the rhythm of the room, in the way Plagueis moved, slightly more careful, almost respectful, as if he already knew what was required. There were no speeches, no betrayal, just a moment. Tenebrous collapsed in the corner of the lab, his chest tight, his limbs frozen, a reaction perhaps, one he had not foreseen, one planted by the very apprentice he had molded. Plagueis stepped forward, knelt beside him, and said nothing. The silence stretched. Was this how it was meant to end? Quietly, without anger or hate? Maybe that was the final twist. Maybe hate was never needed. Maybe control had devoured them both in the end and left only silence. Tenebrous looked up one last time. "You will do what I could not," he said softly. "One set you." Plagueis didn't nod, didn't speak, just stood, tall and still, and watched the light fade from his master's eyes. Later, when the body had cooled, Plagueis burned the remains, not as a ritual, not for closure, but because the experiment was complete, and all data must be cleared before the next begins. But what if Tenebrous hadn't truly died that day? What if part of him had remained buried inside the thoughts of his apprentice, a quiet whisper behind the confidence, a question hidden beneath the certainty? Could it be that even after death, his experiment still continued, not through legacy, not through lineage, but through doubt? The kind of doubt that grows roots in silence. And in that silence waits. Death came for Darth Tenebrous in silence. It did not crash through the stars, or burn through fleets, or roar through the Force. It came as he stood on a barren world, surrounded by roots he did not plant, and shadows he could no longer measure. Plagueis had done it. The apprentice had become the executioner, and for a moment, just a moment, Tenebrous understood, not the betrayal that he had anticipated, not the pain that was irrelevant, but something else, something quieter. He understood that all his calculations had missed something. He tried to speak, not to plead, but to record, to preserve a final observation. But the breath would not come. His lungs, engineered to perfection, collapsed. His mind, once faster than any droid's, began to fracture. There was no clarity, no final proof, only silence. And yet, something lingered. The Force, which he had once tried to manipulate like an equation, did not release him. It did not let him vanish. He did not become one with it, not in the way the Jedi dreamed of. But neither was he gone. Somewhere outside the limits of his own design, he still was. In time, whispers would spread through Sith archives, fragments of Plagueis' notes, strange anomalies in the Force, incomplete holocrons found abandoned in systems thought lost. Some claimed they were fakes. Others dismissed them as legends, but a few believed that Darth Tenebrous had survived, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence, a pattern, a thought that did not stop thinking. Could it be that the very logic he worshipped had found a way to loop itself endlessly, that a mind so obsessed with avoiding death had discovered a back door into eternity? If so, what was he now? Plagueis once wrote of dreams that did not feel like his own, equations forming in sleep, visions of stars being born in reverse, ideas that arrived fully formed without effort or context. He believed them to be echoes, leftovers, residual noise from a master he had killed. But what if it was more? What if those ideas were not echoes, but whispers? Tenebrous had always seen the Force as a code to be cracked, not a will to be served. He believed prophecy was just ignorance wearing robes, that visions were random static interpreted by those too weak to bear silence. But if he was wrong, if the Force was more than energy, more than motion, then what had he become within it? There are theories. Hidden scrolls from forbidden sects speak of mental immortality, not the spirit, not the soul, but the mind preserved like a virus inside the Force, waiting, learning, watching. Could Tenebrous have bent his consciousness into such a shape? And if so, was he still him, or just a loop of logic? A ghost made of thought, with no feeling left to know he had once been alive. Some say that the rise of Plagueis was not the end of Tenebrous, but his evolution, that through Plagueis he refined himself, sharpened his will, tested new limits. And when Plagueis died, another whisper took root. Some believe that even Palpatine, in his moments of rage and vision, glimpsed flashes of a mind not his own, patterns, probabilities, cold, perfect logic. Was Tenebrous still moving the galaxy, not through a body, not through power, but through infection? Thought infection. Thought infection. A Sith Lord who had become an idea too stubborn to die. And if so, is he still out there? Watching? Waiting? But death didn't come for Darth Tenebrous in the way it came for others. His final breath wasn't a scream or a whisper. It was a calculation. A last attempt to run the numbers one more time and win. But as his lungs failed and his organs began to shut down, something stirred that was not part of the equation. Tenebrous had always dismissed the idea of a spirit. He believed in patterns, not ghosts. And yet, as his body fell still, he realized he was still aware. Not alive, but aware, consciousness, lingering without breath. He could think, observe, react. Was it a trick of the brain in its final moments, or had he built something far more dangerous than even he had predicted? He had theorized it long ago, that consciousness might be preserved through quantum entanglement in midi-chlorian clusters. That a powerful enough mind with proper preparation could imprint its own neural structure into the living energy field that surrounds all things. He never called it a soul. That was too primitive, but perhaps this was that very thing. He could no longer speak, no longer move, but he could watch. He could sense the world around him through faint ripples, faint echoes in the Force, and the strongest echo of all came from his apprentice, Plagueis. He saw him standing there, cold and quiet, staring down at his fallen master. Not with regret, not with hate, but with something else, a kind of curiosity, a patient hunger. Tenebrous realized in that moment that Plagueis had not been tricked into betrayal. He had waited for it, calculated it, wanted it. The student had become the mirror, cold, ruthless, and just as mathematical, and yet different. Tenebrous felt himself pulled toward him, not physically, but mentally, spiritually. If he dared use that word, he wondered, had he prepared Plagueis so thoroughly that his own mind had found shelter inside the apprentice's thoughts? It was not possession, not control, more like haunting. He began to sense Plagueis' thoughts, feel them. At first, it was like static, background noise, but then clearer, ambitions, experiments, doubts. Tenebrous watched silently as Plagueis began to explore deeper mysteries of the Force, not just domination, but manipulation, mutation, creation. It was both pride and fear that stirred within the shadow of the Master, because Plagueis was not just continuing the work, he was refining it, perfecting it, and questioning things Tenebrous had never dared to question. Could the Force itself be altered? Could life be forced to obey? Tenebrous had wanted control, but Plagueis wanted transformation. And all the while Tenebrous was still there, trapped, anchored, preserved. He didn't know, but he began to notice something disturbing. He couldn't set move forward, couldn't set let go. He had not passed into some peaceful beyond, nor merged with the Force, as some Jedi claimed. He was caught between equations and echoes, a flicker of mind without body, and the longer he lingered, the more he began to feel small. The Force, as he now experienced it, was not just energy, it was emotion, memory, conflict, pain. It surged in waves, crashing through him without mercy. His cold logic had no answer for that. His formulas couldn't block the tide. And worse still, he was not alone. There were others, shadows, presences, watching, waiting, some of them familiar, some ancient. They didn't speak in words. They pressed against his mind, like wind pressing against glass. He had become something they recognized, a fragment, an echo, perhaps even a threat. Was this the fate of all Sith, to be devoured by the very Force they tried to command? Or had he stepped into something far stranger? Tenebrous began to wonder if this was truly immortality, or a new kind of death, a death without silence, a death that listens. And just when he thought he had mapped the shape of this prison, something changed. A voice, not spoken, but felt. It was Plagueis, thinking, remembering. Not with fear, not with love, but with purpose. The apprentice was calling upon the past, seeking answers, and without knowing it, he pulled Tenebrous's presence closer, used it as a lens, as a boundary to push against. Tenebrous realized he had become a memory inside a mind that no longer needed him. Could it be that the Force does not grant immortality, but absorbs the ones who seek it most? Was this always meant to happen? Time passed, though Tenebrous could no longer measure it. There was no sun, no planet, no ticking clock, just moments, thoughts, feelings, echoes. At first they were mostly Plagueis. His apprentice was strong, focused, and filled with questions. His mind burned like a star, always reaching. Tenebrous clung to that light. It gave him shape. It let him exist. But as Plagueis grew, something began to shift. The thoughts changed, became sharper, darker. He was no longer seeking Tenebrous's approval. He was challenging it, reshaping it, even mocking it. The legacy that had once been Tenebrous's pride was now being broken apart and rebuilt under a new vision. And Tenebrous could do nothing to stop it. He wasn't a voice, he wasn't a ghost, he was a shadow caught inside a stronger shadow. And as Plagueis grew more powerful, more confident, the space left for Tenebrous's presence began to shrink. There were times when he could barely feel anything at all. Days, maybe weeks, where there was nothing but static. No thoughts, no feelings, just emptiness. Then suddenly, another flare. But this time, it wasn't Plagueis. It was someone else. Younger, wilder, more chaotic. There was laughter in this mind. Arrogance, fire. It burned different than Plagueis's cold brilliance. Tenebrous recognized the shape, not the person, but the pattern. This was Plagueis's own student, another apprentice, another link in the chain. But how was Tenebrous feeling him? The answer came slowly, painfully. His presence had bled into Plagueis so completely that now even the apprentice's apprentice carried a trace of him. Not memory, not legacy, something else. A fingerprint in the Force. And this new mind, this storm of ambition and cruelty, gave Tenebrous another place to exist. A flicker, a foothold, even if only briefly. He could feel the thrill of domination in this one. The hunger for secrets. The obsession with power, not for control, but for destruction. And for a moment, Tenebrous feared something deeper. What if this one didn't just want to escape death, but erase life itself? He tried to pull back, to retreat, but he had no body, no hands, no anchor. He was thought without motion, and now the current was stronger than ever. He began to feel as if he were dissolving, slowly, painfully, across minds that did not know him and would never remember him. This wasn't immortality. This was delusion. He had thought himself preserved, but maybe he had only delayed the forgetting. There were no temples with his name, no statues, no records. The galaxy didn't know Tenebrous had ever lived, and the ones who did were replacing him with every breath. Even the Force seemed indifferent. It moved as it always had, flowing through the stars, the soil, the souls of the living and the lost. It didn't remember names. It didn't honor plans. It simply was. And Tenebrous, once proud and precise, was now just a ripple in that vast tide. Still, something kept him from vanishing completely. Maybe it was the echoes of his own stubbornness. Maybe it was unfinished thought. Or maybe, just maybe, the Force didn't destroy what it absorbed. Maybe it listened. Maybe it learned. And in those quiet moments, when no mind was near, when no thought echoed his name, was I wrong? Not about power, not about science, but about himself. Had he ever truly known what he was becoming? Or had he mistaken control for meaning? That question didn't come from fear. It came from something far more dangerous to a Sith: doubt. And once it began, it never stopped. What if Plagueis had surpassed him not because he betrayed the rule of two, but because he had finally understood it? What if death was not the enemy, but the teacher? What if the Force had always been watching, waiting for someone to stop trying to conquer it and start listening? Tenebrous had no voice to say these things, but he thought them, and the Force might have heard. Sometimes Tenebrous imagined what his body must look like now. Bones scattered in darkness, skulls buried beneath shifting rock, flesh turned to dust. A body so carefully maintained, now forgotten by all but worms. He imagined that place often, not because he missed it, but because it was the last thing that had truly been his. The last thing no one could take. But even that wasn't true anymore. Time took everything. And yet, somehow, he remained. In glimpses, in whispers, in the subtle, nearly invisible strings that tied one Sith to another. Plagueis, Sidious, and maybe whoever came after. The line had not ended with him. It had twisted, morphed, become something darker, less scientific, more brutal. Tenebrous had wanted mastery of life and death, but through knowledge, through understanding, what followed was something else, something crueler. And that made him wonder, had he planted a seed of genius or of madness? When Sidious executed his final plan, when he took the title of Emperor and brought darkness to the galaxy, did a fragment of Tenebrous watch? Did he feel pride or horror. Because the Sith had won, but the cost was everything. Entire planets reduced to ash, billions of voices silenced, not for balance, not for study, but for fear, control, ego. This was not his vision, and yet it bore his fingerprints. The rule of two twisted into something self-consuming, the science of immortality reduced to unnatural experiments, and most of all, the silence that followed. No more debates, no more searching, just power for power's sake. Was this truly the Sith legacy, or had it become something else entirely? Tenebrous drifted through that thought like smoke through an empty temple. He could feel the outline of everything, but touch nothing, understand everything, but change nothing. And maybe that was the final lesson. That knowledge without purpose becomes weight. That power without direction devours itself. He had believed he was building something eternal, a mind that would outlive stars. But the stars didn't care. They burned, they collapsed, they were born again, without names. And now, neither did the Force. It had accepted him, absorbed him, but it had not bowed to him. Because the Force had never belonged to the Sith. It had never belonged to anyone. It simply moved, carried, waited. It remembered pain, but didn't weep. It remembered light, but didn't stead shine. It remembered him, but didn't speak. And in that vast silence, Tenebrous faced a truth so heavy, so wide, it could only be felt, not spoken. He was no longer the master. He was no longer the mind. He was a memory in motion, a whisper in the wind of other people's choices. He could watch, he could wonder, but he could never return. And maybe that was the price of reaching too far. Maybe immortality wasn't meant to be taken, only given. And the Force chose who to remember. The Force is not a door, it's a mirror. Tenebrous had once believed it was something to open, to step through, to conquer. But now he saw it differently. It didn't just show you what you wanted. It showed you what you were. And what he saw was himself, multiplied, echoed, distorted through the lives that followed him. Plagueis, the cold architect. Sidious, the roaring fire. Vader, the silence behind the storm. Each one had taken something from him and left something behind. Not in tribute, not in loyalty, but because ideas are harder to kill than flesh. He was not a ghost haunting them. He was the shape beneath their shadows. And yet, for all that he had passed on, something was still missing. He had tried to turn the Force into a system. He had tried to bend it with logic, measure it with numbers, own it with equations. But the Force had never been a problem to solve. It was a story, and Tenebrous had only ever learned how to write footnotes. Maybe that was why he failed. Because the Force could be felt, it could be channeled, it could even be shaped, but it could never be solved. And in the end, all his knowledge, all his planning had led to others who misunderstood him even more. Plagueis had taken his vision and made it colder. Sidious had taken Plagueis' work and turned it to cruelty. And beyond them came only silence. No heir, no student, just a broken line of ambition devouring itself. Was this always meant to happen? Had the rule of two created something so narrow, so sharp, that it cut itself in half every time it tried to grow? What if that was the curse? That each Sith, in seeking a perfect apprentice, built their own grave? That in creating someone strong enough to carry the legacy, they also created someone who no longer needed them? Could Tenebrous have escaped that? He thought, once he could. That by becoming more than Sith, more than flesh, he could rewrite the ending. But endings always come. They may not look like death. They may not sound like silence. Sometimes they feel like nothing at all, just the slow fading of thought into echo. And yet something still remained. A single thread, thin, quiet, almost forgotten. A trace of awareness that lingered not because of anger or pride, but because of something older, curiosity. Not power, not victory. Just the question that had haunted him from the beginning. What is the Force, really? Was it chaos wearing the mask of order? Was it life pretending to be destiny? Or was it simply everything watching itself unfold? Tenebrous didn't know. And maybe that was the point. That even in the end, even in a form without breath, without hands, without voice, he could still wonder, still ask, still learn. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of immortality. Not as a god, not as a master, but as a mind still reaching. The mind of Darth Tenebrous had always been a machine, not cold but measured, not cruel but efficient. Every action, every word, every silence, calculated. When death came for him, it did not come as a surprise. He had already planned for it. He had already planned for what came after. Beneath layers of thought no apprentice could hear, Tenebrous had built something, a pattern, a structure, not a holocron, not a voice trapped in a crystal. It was something else, something quieter, something viral. Plagueis thought he had killed his master, and in truth, he had the body of Tenebrous rotted beneath the surface of Baldemnik. But perhaps the death of a Sith Lord was never as final as others believed. Perhaps Tenebrous had never truly planned to win. Perhaps he only planned to linger, hidden, waiting. He had studied systems, organic, mechanical, political, even spiritual. He knew that influence didn't always need a presence. Sometimes it only needed a seed. Something small, something planted, something that would grow when no one was watching. And so before his final breath, before his apprentice turned and walked away, Tenebrous had already passed it on. Not with a whisper, not with a secret, but with code. An idea shaped like a shadow, too soft to notice, too quiet to hear, but always there. Could it be that what Plagueis believed to be his own ambition never truly was? What if the questions he asked, the visions he chased, the truths he uncovered were never truly his? What if they were echoes, residue? It wouldn't have been hard for Tenebrous. He had watched Plagueis for years, not just as a teacher, but as a designer. Every lesson, every frustration, every withheld truth, it was all part of a program, not one written in machines, but in flesh. Perhaps the virus was not data. Perhaps it was doubt or desire. A subtle push toward conclusions Tenebrous had already prepared. He didn't need to speak after death. He only needed the idea to survive, and in Plagueis, it did. When Plagueis sought immortality, not as myth but as science, was that curiosity, or was it inherited? When he broke from Sith tradition and explored midi-chlorians, did he believe it was his own discovery, or was he walking a path laid years before, paved by thoughts that were never his? It is easy to imagine the Sith Grand Plan as the child of Sidious, a scheme born from one man's hunger. But what if it was older? What if it was passed down, unseen, unnamed, but alive? Tenebrous had believed the Sith had become too theatrical, too loud. He had studied Republic corruption, not as a weakness, but as an opportunity. He didn't believe in battles. He believed in infection, quiet entry, slow growth, influence that felt natural, not forced. And Plagueis followed that exact method. He did not conquer. He invested. He advised. He whispered, just like Tenebrous would have, just like Tenebrous taught. Was that legacy, or was it control? Some theories speak of Sith spirits, wraiths trapped between death and the Force. But Tenebrous wasn't interested in spirits. He wanted structure, persistence, something the Jedi couldn't sense, something the Force couldn't cleanse, something no apprentice could resist because they wouldn't know it was there. A virus doesn't speak. A virus doesn't glow. It just runs, quietly, until the host becomes it. Could that be what happened to Plagueis? He had dreams, he had doubts. At times, he wondered if his thoughts were truly his, but he dismissed them. He had to question that would be to unravel himself. But what if Tenebrous had made sure he couldn't unravel? What if his apprentice's mind had no clean thread to pull, only knots and loops designed to keep him moving forward, never backward? If so, then Tenebrous's greatest creation was not a weapon, not a clone, not a legacy, but an infection. An infection dressed as ambition. An idea that made itself look like power. Plagueis had always believed he was the master of his own path. The one Sith who had broken tradition without breaking order. He studied life at the cellular level. He believed the Force could be bent by understanding, not just will, but maybe that belief was never his to begin with. Tenebrous had been obsessed with control, not just over others, but over the future. He didn't trust chaos. He didn't trust instinct, so he built systems, and Plagueis became one. It's possible that Tenebrous saw no difference between code and thought. He believed patterns could be written into people, that with enough exposure, enough repetition, an apprentice would not even notice they were being rewritten, not brainwashed, just updated. Maybe that's why Plagueis never questioned the strange patterns in his thoughts, why he didn't notice that every time he resisted the Jedi's view of the Force, it felt natural, why he believed in manipulation, not because of what he saw, but because it simply made sense. As if the idea had always been there, waiting. Was that the virus? Not a presence, but a framework. A design hiding beneath the surface of the mind. Some believe Tenebrous's spirit clung to life, watching from within. But there's another possibility. A colder one, that Tenebrous didn't survive because he didn't need to. He had already installed himself where it mattered. Not in the Force, not in some artifact, but in the operating system of his apprentice's mind. And once Plagueis began to pass on his own knowledge to Sidious, what else did he pass with it? Plagueis believed he had shaped Sidious, that he had taught him control, secrecy, and patience. But what if the shaping had started long before Sidious was chosen? What if the shape was never Plagueis to begin with? It's not impossible. The Sith Order was designed around inheritance. Each master leaves something behind. Most leave scars, some leave knowledge, but Tenebrous, he may have left a loop, a recursive idea that kept itself alive by moving host to host, each one believing they were the original, each one believing they were the author of the plan. That kind of virus doesn't scream, it whispers, and it only whispers what you already want to hear. Could that be why the grand plan worked so well? Could that be why it all felt so smooth? From the fall of the Republic to the rise of the Empire, each move had purpose, but the beauty of it wasn't in the outcome. It was in the illusion of authorship. Sidious believed he had forged destiny. Plagueis believed he had trained a god, but maybe neither of them were truly leading. Maybe they were executing lines of code written by a ghost who never needed to haunt. And maybe Tenebrous smiled, not from beyond the grave, but from the echo of every Sith decision that followed. What's more chilling is the idea that none of them ever knew that even as they changed the galaxy, they were trapped in someone else's logic, someone else's design, not because they were weak, but because the code had disguised itself as strength. That's what made Tenebrous different. He didn't want monuments, he wanted recursion. A system that kept him alive not through memory, but through behavior, through habit, through thought patterns, so subtle they didn't feel learned, they felt inherited. And isn't that the perfect infection? One you don't fight, one you don't see, one that never announces itself because it already sounds like your own voice. Plagueis often spoke of midichlorians as the key to life and death. He believed they could be persuaded, reprogrammed, even defied. But perhaps they weren't the only things being programmed. Perhaps he too had been rewritten long before he began his experiments. If Tenebrous truly inserted a pattern into his mind, then everything Plagueis thought he discovered might have been a reenactment, a loop, a script disguised as a breakthrough. And if that's true, then his obsession with creating life wasn't just his own idea. It was planted, watered, and allowed to grow inside him like a seed waiting to bloom. Maybe Tenebrous knew that true control didn't require presence, it only required momentum. A direction locked in so deeply, the mind would move toward it, even without knowing why. And maybe that's why Plagueis never looked back, why he never questioned his path. Because it wasn't a choice. It was the only route that ever existed for him. He thought he was reshaping the Sith. But what if the Sith were simply reshaping themselves through him? And what if that was Tenebrous's final experiment? Not to live forever in the traditional sense, not to cling to a body, but to survive as a structure, an idea buried deep enough to live through other people, other minds. Could it be that immortality doesn't always mean awareness? Could it mean influence without consciousness? Action without identity? Maybe Tenebrous didn't care if he could think after death. Maybe he only cared that his design would keep moving, that his logic would never be deleted, that every generation of Sith would unknowingly carry his fingerprint. And what better way to hide than inside your enemy? Because the Jedi could sense spirits, they could detect shadows, but they couldn't trace a thought. They couldn't trace a pattern of belief. Plagueis's methods were subtle. His faith in science over mysticism, his rejection of prophecy, his cold understanding of power. These weren't just philosophies. They were symptoms, echoes of Tenebrous, repeating themselves inside a new vessel. Even Sidious, brilliant as he was, followed the same lines. Control through manipulation, victory through systems, not battles. Even his idea of hiding in plain sight, was it genius or inheritance? That sips the question the virus dares us to ask. Not who started the plan, but did anyone start it at all? What if its set's always been running? What if Tenebrous didn't create it either, but merely discovered it and gave it form? There's something deeply unsettling in the thought that no Sith ever had free will. That every dark choice, every secret act was already calculated by a code no one could see. Not a prophecy, not the Force, but a machine made of logic and silence. And that brings us to the cruelest part of the theory. If it's two's true, then even Tenebrous was instead free. Because viruses mutate, they evolve. What begins as control can become compulsion. What starts as design can become destiny. And what if the virus didn't belong to Tenebrous either? What if he too was only the next host? It's a quiet horror. The idea that the Sith Order isn't just built on betrayal, but on recursion, on repeating loops of ambition that stretch back farther than any one master. A virus that rewrites minds so completely, the infected don't even feel sick. They feel powerful, and that's how it survives. Plagueis began to change, slowly at first, subtle shifts. He stopped calling Tenebrous a failure, stopped thinking of his master as a relic of the past. Instead, he began to speak of him as a necessary step, a precursor. Something in his mind had softened, or maybe it had hardened. He no longer sought to destroy the old ways. He sought to perfect them. That wasn't his voice anymore. That was someone else's echo. Tenebrous, long dead, was speaking again. But it didn't sound like madness. That's the genius of the virus. It never screams. It whispers, not in words but in instincts, quiet preferences, a tilt of interest, a fixation, and Plagueis followed them like they were his own thoughts, because they felt natural, familiar. But maybe that's how infection works. Not by creating something new, but by changing what's already there. There were moments when he would pause, look inward, a sense that something wasn't quite right, like a phrase he couldn't remember writing, or a step he didn't recall taking. But those thoughts passed quickly, because the virus was good. It didn't like to be questioned. It told him he was destined for greatness, that he was free. But what if freedom was the lie? What if that feeling, that overwhelming confidence in his path, was the final symptom? The perfect illusion of control. And when Sidious came, when Plagueis saw him and felt the pull, the excitement, the certainty, was that instinct or programming? Was Sidious chosen by Plagueis, or was he the next trigger in a line of hidden code? Maybe Tenebrous didn't plan for Sidious specifically. Maybe the virus was never about people. It was about continuity, a way to keep a certain kind of thinking alive, no matter who wore the robes. By the time Sidious rose, the virus had changed again. It had shed its skin. It no longer needed hosts who asked questions. It needed believers, disciples. Sidious was perfect, not because he was powerful, but because he didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to wonder where his ideas came from. He didn't ask who he was echoing. He simply obeyed the logic of ambition. And by the time he declared the Sith Grand Plan as his own, there was no one left to remember Tenebrous. No one who would recognize the shape of his thinking. Not even Plagueis, if he had still been alive, could have seen it. Because once the virus passes far enough, it becomes indistinguishable from its host. And maybe that's what Tenebrous wanted all along. To be forgotten. To become something so embedded in the Sith that he no longer needed a name. He became the silence between words, the pause before a cruel decision. The reason every Sith believes the same thing, even if they say it differently. Somewhere along the path, Plagueis did wonder, but never out loud. He would sit in the quiet of his chambers, eyes closed, letting the Force drift through him like a tide. And there were moments, just moments, where he thought he could feel a shadow, not a presence, not a ghost, just a weight, a pattern. He never told Sidious. He didn't want to be seen as paranoid, but he wrote about it. Brief notes, half sentences, thoughts he didn't finish, because some part of him feared that if he wrote the full idea, it might come true. Or maybe it already had. When Sidious finally betrayed and killed Plagueis, the galaxy changed forever. But something else had already changed long before. Plagueis had passed on more than knowledge, more than anger, more than vision. He had passed on a pattern. Sidious believed it was his, that the grand plan, the war, the rise of the Empire, all of it came from his own brilliance, his own clarity. But what if those ideas had been planted? What if the Sith line was never guided by will, but by momentum? The kind that begins slowly and then becomes impossible to stop. The virus didn't need to be conscious anymore. It had grown past that. It had written itself into history, into blood, into instinct. Like a melody heard too many times, it stayed, even when the music stopped. Tenebrous had found a way to live on. Not in the Force, not in the flesh, but in the curve of thought, in the shape of logic, in the way every Sith after him pursued power without pause, without question. Not because they were evil, but because they had no other script to follow. And maybe that sets the scariest part. Not the monsters we can see, but the ideas we can taft. The kind that hide inside victories, that whisper in the moment of triumph, convincing you that you were always meant to win, that this is your destiny, your genius, your power. But what if that feeling wasn't set yours? What if it belonged to something older, something that's been running since before you were born? In time, even Sidious began to repeat things he couldn't explain. Phrases that felt original, but weren't, beliefs that aligned too closely with ones spoken long before. And by then, there was no one left to challenge him. No master above, no partner beside. Only the echo. The virus had done its job. It had hollowed the tree and filled it with new roots. Tenebrous, in the end, didn't need to live forever. He just needed his ideas to, and through those ideas he watched the fall of the Jedi, the birth of the Empire, the rise of Vader, each event a fruit from a tree he had planted in silence, a plan he never got to see, yet somehow still shaped. And what if he sits still shaping it? Not as a ghost, not even as a program, but as the rhythm behind every Sith's breath, as the reason no one ever stops to ask, where did this really begin? Because once a virus rewrites the host's mind, the host can't tell the difference. And maybe no one can anymore, not even us. The Force has always been treated as something sacred to Jedi. It was a path, a current, a whisper in the dark that, if followed with peace and patience, would lead to clarity, but not to Tenebrous. To him, the Force was a riddle, one that could be solved, measured, shaped. It was not a path but a code, not a current but a machine with levers and gears. And somewhere in that machine, he believed, was the era of destiny, waiting to be rewritten. Tenebrous had studied the Force like no Sith before him. Not with awe, with math. He kept no temples, raised no statues. Instead, he buried himself in data. He tracked movements of stars, fluctuations in energy, even patterns in death. His meditations were not done in silence, but surrounded by instruments, calculations, algorithms. He believed that randomness was an illusion, and that behind even the wildest twist of fate, there was a formula. This obsession had one purpose. He didn't want to rule the galaxy for power. He didn't want revenge against the Jedi. What Tenebrous wanted was far stranger. He wanted to outsmart time, to cheat the script written by the Force. Every prophecy, every chosen one, every moment that felt inevitable. He saw it all as a lie, or worse, a prison. He wanted to break it. That's why his interest in cloning wasn't just scientific, it was spiritual. Tenebrous believed that if he could grow life from nothing and give it force sensitivity, then perhaps destiny itself could be tricked. If a being could be made from scratch and yet still feel the force, then maybe the will of the force wasn't a will at all. Maybe it was just a pattern waiting to be interrupted. And so began his experiments. Most Sith pursued cloning to escape death, but Tenebrous had a colder motive. He wanted to test variables. He made mistakes on purpose, altered genes, adjusted timelines. Then he watched how the Force responded. Did the clone feel the Force the same way as the original? Could it be manipulated? Broken, he wasn't cloning people, he was cloning questions, each one a hypothesis in flesh. Some say this is why his body aged so slowly. He had refined the process so much that he began testing on himself, not full duplication. Not yet, but modifications, injections, cells tweaked to slow decay. Rumors whispered of a moment where he paused his own heartbeat for minutes and then restarted it just to prove he could. And what if that's true? What if Tenebrous, in that cold silence, heard something? Something the Jedi had never dared to listen for. Not harmony, not balance, but a glitch, a crack in the symphony. Could it be that the Force didn't always know what it was doing? The more he tested, the more confident he became. When his calculations were precise, the outcomes were predictable. When they weren't, the Force behaved like it was adjusting, correcting, almost resisting, like a game that didn't want to be beaten. This to Tenebrous was proof. The Force wasn't just energy. It wasn't just a presence. It was a program, and all programs had flaws. But the galaxy wasn't ready to hear this. Not the Sith, not even his apprentice. So Tenebrous kept it hidden. His notes were locked in code so dense they read like madness. His lab was hidden inside a crust-locked moon, sealed behind seismic quakes and electromagnetic storms. Only he could reach it. Only he could understand what he'd found. Some believe this is the place where the first signs of Sith alchemy's rebirth began. Not in temples of fire, not in blood-soaked rituals, but in silence, steel, equations. In his hands, alchemy was not magic, it was precision. Not art, it was war. A war not fought with sabers, but with cells. Could this be where the unnatural began? Could this be the spark that later grew into Palpatine's terrible obsession with cloning, with vessels, with children touched by the dark? Maybe Palpatine didn't invent the experiments. Maybe he just followed the map. A map drawn long before his rise by a Sith who never wanted to conquer fate with violence, but with numbers. And maybe, just maybe, Tenebrous never stopped that war. Plagueis never understood what he inherited. Not fully. To him, Tenebrous was a genius. Yes, but one trapped by logic. Plagueis believed in emotion, in the raw unpredictability of life. He thought Tenebrous had missed the heart of the dark side. But what if he didn't miss it? What if he ignored it on purpose? Because while Plagueis studied midichlorians in blood, Tenebrous studied them in time. He believed that midichlorians weren't just carriers of the Force, they were nodes, tiny receivers. And if each one carried a fragment of connection to the Force, then every being was like a signal tower, a point on a massive grid. If enough signals were changed, rerouted, or copied, then maybe the whole grid could be rewritten. That was the core of his theory. Not to change one life, but to change the shape of all lives. To distort the map so deeply that destiny itself would get lost. He didn't believe in chosen ones. He believed in rerouting them, displacing them, creating ghosts in the system. There are legends, rare, half-lost, that mention experiments gone wrong. Creatures born of Sith science who cried out in pain the moment they touched the Force. Beings that collapsed not from wounds, but from contradictions, as if the universe itself rejected their existence. What if those weren't failures? What if they were signs that he was close? Close to what? To creating something the Force couldn't predict. A being outside the current, something that wasn't born but written. A being not of prophecy, but of corruption. And it didn't have to be a clone. It could be a whisper, a concept, a strand of influence placed inside a mind at the right moment. Some say Tenebrous developed mental triggers, patterns of thought that could be planted and left dormant. Not mind control, not possession, just suggestion. Like a virus written in emotion, and once awakened that emotion would guide the person forward, without ever knowing they weren't fully choosing. Could that be what happened to Plagueis? He was brilliant, but he became obsessed with a single path, cheating death through biology. It was almost as if something pushed him toward it, not through violence, not through command, but through quiet shaping, like a program unfolding in the background. Could it be that Tenebrous left more than memories behind? Could it be that he left code? And if he did, was that code meant to end with Plagueis, or to go further? Palpatine once said that Plagueis taught him everything he knew, but not everything he knew himself. A strange phrase, dismissed by many as pride. But what if it was literal? What if even Plagueis didn't know all of what was inside him? What if the virus wasn't a secret he chose to keep, but a secret he never knew he carried? If so, then the grand plan, the great rise of the Sith, the destruction of the Jedi, the turning of Anakin, the fall of the Republic, was not Palpatine's alone, not Plagueis, maybe not even theirs to begin with. Maybe it was Tenebrous' final experiment. A plan planted not in words, but in instincts, in shifts of behavior, in tiny cracks that slowly widened across generations. And by the time the galaxy fell into shadow, the shadow didn't even remember who cast it. What if Tenebrous won? Not with armies, not with thrones, but with silence. A cold, careful push that sent everything off course by just enough. If Tenebrous had planted something inside Plagueis, then what was it designed to do? Not to control, not to speak, but to echo, to push. A haunting presence, not made of sound or spirit, but of unfinished thought. A question without words, a hunger without a name. Plagueis, in his obsession with immortality, never questioned why the obsession burned so deep. He called it purpose. He called it the next step. But maybe it was just a direction whispered from far behind him. A whisper too faint to notice, but too constant to ignore. And if he ever paused long enough to ask why, he never answered himself out loud. The war Tenebrous started wasn't one of lightsabers or battles. It was a war of influence. A war against the pattern of the Force. A war against the very idea that anything was meant to be. He believed fate could be broken down, reversed, and rebuilt, and to do that, he needed pieces. People, events, failures, all arranged like test subjects in a galaxy-sized lab. Some of those pieces were living, some were not. There are ancient writings, forbidden even among Sith, that describe a concept Tenebrous may have explored, Force echoes that could attach to physical places, not spirits, not ghosts, just the memory of intent, stored not in the soul, but in the shape of things. A structure, A tomb, a chamber with symbols carved not for beauty, but for function. What if those symbols were equations? Not magical incantations, but commands. Commands meant not for machines, but for the Force itself. Like computer code carved into stone, waiting to be activated by presence, or pain, or blood. This was not dark magic. This was math, Sith math. Equations of destruction, control, memory, inheritance. Equations that could test whether destiny could be bent, then broken, then replaced. And what about the failed clones? The twisted figures lost in tanks. The half-formed bodies Palpatine hid away. The voices that screamed and disappeared. Were they just mistakes? Or were they echoes of a formula Tenebrous never stopped writing? If Tenebrous believed the Force was just a system, then his goal was never to conquer it with emotion. His goal was to rewrite its logic, to infect it, change its rules from the inside. But to do that, he had to vanish. No one listens to a ghost. No one obeys a dead master. But people follow their own ideas. People act on what they think is theirs. That was the brilliance. That was the horror. If Tenebrous succeeded, no one would ever know he did, because they would believe it was all their idea. That's what made his war silent. Because if you change the code behind the world, you don't need to speak, you don't need to fight, you just wait. And eventually, someone like Palpatine rises, not because you forced him, but because you planted the right absence, because you created a need, because you shaped the universe to require him. So, what does that mean for the Sith? Were they ever truly free, or just vessels in a grand experiment? Was Sidious a master, or a product? Was Anakin's fall the result of Jedi blindness, or a necessary collapse triggered by calculations made long before he was born? And what if the Force itself is still trying to correct the error? Some say the Force seeks balance, but what if that balance was broken not by Jedi arrogance, not by Sith ambition, but by something quieter, something older, something still running? Tenebrous did not shout his beliefs into the galaxy. He etched them. He hid them in apprentices, in temples, in forgotten moons, and deep layers of code. Not digital code, but philosophical patterns that repeated, thoughts that lingered. He didn't need to live forever if the pattern he created did. And maybe that's exactly what happened. What if the rule of two was never just about power, but about data? What if each Sith master wasn't choosing a successor, but uploading a version of the experiment into them, letting it run, letting it evolve, letting it break? What if Plagueis was version 3, Sidious version 4, and Anakin, not a savior or destroyer, but version 5? A test. A new variable introduced into a system designed to strain, to stretch, to snap. Even death wouldn't end the cycle, because once the idea is alive, it keeps moving. That was the design, not survival. Propagation, infection. By the time Sidious began his experiments in cloning, in possession, in body hopping, the code had already won. Because he wasn't doing anything new, he was reenacting something older, something deeper, something that was never his to begin with. And maybe somewhere far in the shadows, Tenebrous would have smiled. Not because he was proud, but because the code worked. And yet, even then, what was he trying to prove? That destiny could be rewritten, or that it never existed in the first place. Maybe the Force isn't a flowing stream. Maybe it's a wall of gears. Gears that only spin because no one questions the design. But Tenebrous questioned it. He didn't try to stop the gears. He tried to change what they were turning, what they were building. That's why he needed minds, not just power. Minds like Plagueis, cold, curious, detached enough to see the galaxy as a series of outcomes, not stories, people as variables, lives as steps. But somewhere in that silence, something changed. Because minds like Plagueis began to think for themselves. They began to wonder not just what could be built, but what should be. And that sips where the war turned. Because if the code works too well, if the program starts to evolve, then maybe it reaches for something the creator never intended. Maybe it resists. Could Plagueis have felt it? A resistance in himself he couldn't explain. A hesitation, a doubt, not fear of failure, but fear that he was just a tool, that his every thought, every dream was the echo of someone else's logic. And what does that do to a Sith? When you realize your purpose might not be yours, does that break you or set you free? Maybe that was the final experiment. Not cloning, not immortality, but control without control. A system that didn't need to be watched, didn't need to be steered, just set in motion and left alone. Tenebrous believed if you built the right mind, it would follow the path on its own. It would make the right mistake. It would believe it was choosing. But what if it didn't start? What if the perfect apprentice wasn't the one who obeyed, but the one who disobeyed in just the right way? A rebellion not loud, not wild, but surgical, quiet, internal. One that questioned the very root of the code itself. Plagueis may have believed he was the first to try and break the chains of death, but perhaps those chains were never even locked, just placed around him, loose, waiting to see what he would do. Would he tighten them? Would he cut them? Would he make new ones? No one knows what Plagueis truly discovered, what secrets he kept from Sidious, what calculations he never shared. But maybe the silence speaks loudest. Because in the end, Sidious did everything Tenebrous might have predicted. He chased immortality. He embraced unnatural life. He manipulated bloodlines, worlds, prophecies. He turned Jedi against Jedi, planets against peace. He made the galaxy scream, and in doing so, he fulfilled the variables. He proved the code still ran. But something unexpected happened too. The experiment failed. Sidious died. And not just once. Was that failure, or the final proof, that the code had gone too far, that it couldn't be trusted, that it created power without purpose, hunger without wisdom? Maybe that's why the Force responded, not to bring balance but to clean up the mess. The Skywalker line, the raw, chaotic answer to Sith design, not born of order, born of imbalance, chosen not for strength, but for unpredictability, for emotion, for love. Things the code couldn't set account for. Things Tenebrous may have dismissed as noise. But what if that noise was the answer? What if the Force wasn't a machine to be outwitted, but a song to be heard? And maybe, just maybe, someone like Anakin wasn't a variable in a Sith equation, but the crack in its screen. A reminder that no matter how many patterns you build, some things can sit be programmed. Some destinies can set be rewritten. Some stories write themselves. And maybe that was always the silent war. Not against the Jedi, not against death, but against the very idea that the galaxy could be controlled. Tenebrous fought that war with silence, with math, with patience. But in the end, the galaxy answered not with numbers, but with feeling. And maybe that's the one thing even the smartest Sith could never predict. There were no statues of Darth Tenebrous, no temples carved in his name, no holocrons that whispered his truths in ancient tongues. Even among the Sith, his legacy was strange, distant, as if he had been real but never present, known but never remembered. What kind of Sith leaves behind no fingerprints, only questions? Some said he was a master of secrecy. Others believed he wanted it that way, but maybe the answer was darker. Maybe there was never a man behind the mask. Maybe the mask was the man. Tenebrous lived inside patterns, inside numbers. His teachings weren't just dark, they were cold, clinical. He measured life in probabilities. He saw the Force not as energy, but as data, a structure to be rewritten. He did not feel anger or fear the way others did. He calculated it, predicted it, shaped it. Could such a being ever be called Sith, or was that just the word closest to what he truly was? Plagueis remembered his voice, but even he admitted he never truly knew him. Not the way a student knows a master. Tenebrous taught like a machine teaches, efficient, sharp, and always distant. Some theories claim Tenebrous was never born in the usual way, that he was bred, engineered, the last result of an old Sith experiment that had been hidden, buried, and almost forgotten. A being grown in a lab, programmed to think beyond emotion, beyond legacy, beyond the hunger for power that drove others. If that was true, then what was he really? There's something eerie about a Sith who doesn't care about revenge or conquest. Something that makes you wonder, what did he care about? Because if he didn't want control, maybe he wanted something worse. Not control of others, but of time itself, of logic, of the code that runs beneath all life. Could it be that Tenebrous saw himself not as a leader, but as a rewrite, a correction? And what if he didn't die? Plagueis believed he was alone after Tenebrous's death. But there were moments, strange moments, dreams, thoughts that weren't his, equations he'd never studied, yet somehow understood. What if they weren't his at all? What if Tenebrous hadn't trained a student, but installed a system? Not a legacy, a virus. And Plagueis was just the host. The Sith always feared ghosts, not the kind that haunt halls, but the ones that live in minds. Ideas that echo long after their source is gone, whispers that shape choices without anyone noticing. Tenebrous never needed to shout. His silence was louder than words. And if he truly left a piece of himself behind, it would not be loud. It would wait. Plagueis may have believed he was building a new future, but maybe the future was building him. The grand plan he thought was his own, the idea of a Sith empire hidden in shadow, rising from the cracks of democracy. What if that wasn't new at all? What if it was old? What if it was Tenebrous, still running? It would explain the patterns, the way the plan moved even after Plagueis died, the way Sidious, without ever knowing Tenebrous, carried pieces of his vision, like a map passed through hands too blind to see it. And if it's true, if Tenebrous still lives, not in body but in influence, then perhaps the greatest Sith of all time never ruled, never killed, never showed his face. He just whispered, and the galaxy listened. There's an unease in the archives, a gap. Records of Tenebrous exist, but only just. Names that fade, data that breaks apart, as if something or someone wanted him to disappear, not with a scream, but with silence. Not erased, but hidden in plain sight, like a line of code that looks like nothing until it runs. Could that have been his final design? To become unreadable, untraceable, but still alive. Some say that's how the Sith win, not through war, not through power, but by convincing others their ideas were always their own. If Tenebrous did this, if he infected the minds of those after him with visions they believed were theirs, then maybe he did what no Sith before him ever could. He made his death irrelevant. Because if you don't need to live to control the future, then you don't need a body. You don't need memory. You only need one idea that sticks, one spark that jumps from mind to mind, shaping the course of everything without ever being noticed. And maybe that was Tenebrous. Not a Sith, not a ghost, just a seed. Still growing. The galaxy has seen monsters, tyrants, emperors, but sometimes the most dangerous ones are the quietest. They leave no statue, no temple, just a thought, a feeling, a shift in the way people dream. If Tenebrous was never meant to be remembered, perhaps that was his masterpiece. Not to be known, but to be felt. Maybe that's why the Sith never speak of him, why Sidious never mentioned his name. Because somewhere deep down, there was fear, not fear of his return, but fear that he never truly left, that he wasn't a person at all, but a doorway, one they all walked through, never realizing. What if the rule of two was never about power? What if it was about survival? Not of the Sith, but of the code behind them. A virus that wears many names, many faces, but always returns. Tenebrous may be gone, his body dust, his name fading, but as long as the dark finds a mind to speak through, he is not gone, not really. And maybe, just maybe, he never was